I was helping a few ants fight their battle. That's when I accidentally discovered the entrance to a Lilliputian world. A single egg I placed inside was enough to cover the entire area. It fed the whole village of 50 people for 3 straight days. Because of that, the people here worship me like a god. I bring them food every day until I'm stuck at home. I even ended up saving a young girl and her mother by chance. That was the moment I realized I loved this tiny world more than anything. It was actually the world of the Ming Dynasty, discovered through a simple house. I picked up a grain of sand from an anthill and brought it home with me. With excitement, I realized there were tiny people living inside that speck. Right there inside. At that moment, a young girl was holding a bamboo basket. She held it tight in her hand, looking so desperate. Heading down to the bottom, I started clearing away the weeds. There was bark scattered across the ground near the top. Nothing but yellow sand everywhere. Every now and then, I would find a few green leaves. 3 of them appeared, wielding rusted swords. He rushed into the village and started screaming. "Hey, you people inside, listen up. Hand over every scrap of food you have. If you don't, I'll slaughter every last one of you with a single." Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. A second later, the door to the young girl's house was kicked off its hinges. The bandits grabbed her and her mother by the hair. They were dragged outside, both of them sobbing in terror. "Great king, please let us go. We truly have nothing left. We have nothing to eat. Look, we've been surviving on grass roots." The Lilliputian bandit didn't care. He just glared at the girl with pure malice. "I don't care if you're eating grass or tree bark. If you can't give me food, I'll carve you into pieces right now." The girl was so terrified she couldn't even speak through her tears. Her mother lunged forward to shield her, begging for mercy. But the bandit didn't hesitate. He slashed the old woman's throat in one motion. A spray of red liquid shot out into the dirt. He raised his blade again, ready to finish off the young girl next. Watching this, I couldn't hold back anymore. I ripped the lid off the landscape box. I reached my hand inside, aiming a single finger to flick him away. In Gao village of the Ming Dynasty, a giant hand suddenly descended from the clouds. Gao Yue also felt something suddenly blocking out the sun. She lifted her head, her face still drenched in tears. She looked up and saw a giant hand reaching down rapidly toward her. I flicked my finger right over the top of her head. The bandit who had just raised his blade to strike was sent flying backward, right past Gao Yue's side. He soared through the air like a rag doll. He flew across the sky toward the distant outskirts. He was launched far outside the village and finally hit the ground. There was a sickening, heavy thud. Every bone in his body shattered upon impact. The faint sound of wind and rain still echoed in the distance. Thunder rumbled as my hand retreated back into the clouds and vanished. In that moment, Gao Yue even forgot about her own father. She stopped crying and stared at the sky, completely stunned. The other bandits saw their comrade get blasted away and panicked. They regrouped, glaring fiercely at Gao Yue and shouting, "Little brat, what did you do?" Gao Yue held her mother's body in her arms, shaking her head in a daze. "If you won't talk, I have plenty of ways to make you scream." The bandit leader stepped forward and raised his rusted blade to cut her down. But in that very instant, everything changed. The bandit leader let out a scream and vanished into thin air. The remaining bandits froze, their eyes wide with shock. A few of them snapped out of it and started screaming at Gao Yue. Their shouts were a chaotic mess of rage, panic, and pure terror. That was the moment Gao Yue realized the truth. She was the only one who could see my giant hand. She looked back up at the swirling clouds, and through a rift in the sky, she saw my face looking down like a god. She gently laid her mother's body down on the dirt. She knelt toward the heavens and cried out, "Celestial Lord, save us." The wind howled and thunder cracked as something began to fall from the sky. The bandits broke rank and tried to scatter through the village, but they didn't get far. My massive palm descended from the clouds. I slammed it down, crushing every single bandit into the mud. A cloud of dust exploded outward. The terrarium finally fell into a temporary silence. Slowly, the doors of the surrounding houses began to creak open. The villagers of this tiny world crawled out and gathered in the center of town. They emerged from their homes, surrounding the bandits I had just crushed. While the village elders argued amongst themselves in low voices, they kept glancing nervously up at the sky. They raised their hands toward the clouds over and over again. Others crowded around the girl, asking if she was all right. Their voices sounded like the buzzing of mosquitoes. I couldn't hear them unless they shouted. A moment later, the people of this miniature world got straight to work. They began stripping the tiny bandit corpses of everything they had. They took their weapons and their clothes, distributing them family by family. Then, they dug a pit outside the village and buried the bodies. The men gathered some scraps of wood to build markers. They placed them in front of the graves of their fallen neighbors. But it seemed no one in this village knew how to read or write. Not a single word was carved into the wood, only crooked knife marks to identify the families. The girl knelt before one of the graves, her strength completely gone. She didn't cry out anymore. She just stared at the dirt. She bowed her head to the ground several times in silent prayer. I watched the scene in total silence for a long time. I didn't step away to rest until deep into the night. The next morning, I boiled 2 eggs for breakfast and went straight back to the terrarium. The tiny people inside were already out in force. They had started their work, and that same girl was standing in the center of the village. She was holding a small bamboo basket. She was desperately digging for grass roots in the sandy soil. She had just lost her mother yesterday. She shouldn't have been over her grief yet. I felt a pang of pity for her, but she was already forced to dedicate herself to the hunt for food. Gao Yang had been searching that same patch of dirt for hours. She had spent half the day out there, and her hands and feet were growing more and more numb. Her tiny body was beginning to lean to one side. She was swaying on her feet, barely able to stand. I didn't know how much longer she could hold on before she collapsed. Starvation was setting in, and she knew her end was drawing closer every second. That was when I let out a heavy sigh that echoed through their sky. Gao Yang heard the sound and froze in her tracks, looking devastated. She snapped her head up toward the noise and saw my face appearing above her. I was looking down through the clouds like a titan. The girl realized she was safe and threw herself to the ground with fervor. Heavenly Lord, I am so hungry. I can't go on. Please, have mercy and save me. Gao Yang looked like a helpless little animal, waiting quietly for a blessing from heaven. But after waiting for what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. She slowly raised her hand and wiped her eyes, trying to see clearly. When she looked up again, she realized the face in the clouds was gone. I had vanished without a trace, and she thought I wasn't willing to help her. Maybe killing those ruthless bandits yesterday was just a one-time thing. Perhaps the great God was just acting on a whim. How could a divine being care about every single person's needs? She thought about her suffering and realized she had offered nothing to the great God. Why should I help her for free? She gritted her teeth and went back to digging for roots. On my end, I stood up from the edge of the sandbox and walked into the house. I headed straight for the kitchen. The stove was on, and the water was heating up. The pot was already starting to boil. The 2 eggs I had dropped in earlier were almost fully cooked. I grabbed an egg in my hand and walked back over to the sandbox. The little girl inside was still struggling to find anything in that sandy soil. I looked at her and thought, little girl, I'm going to try and give you something to eat. Suddenly, the girl froze in place. She looked up at the sky, her eyes wide with shock. The clouds began to part once again. A massive hand descended from the heavens. It reached down, holding an enormous egg. I lowered my hand toward her carefully. Yes, this egg is for you, I said. I watched her reaction from above the sandbox. I boiled it, so you can eat it right away. Gao Yang heard my voice echoing like a great god. Finally, she moved. She summoned her courage and approached the giant egg. She tapped the shell, and it made a dull thud like solid rock. She picked up a heavy stone from the ground. Was she really going to use all her strength? She slammed the stone against the eggshell. Crack, the stone shattered into pieces, but the egg didn't budge. The shell was perfectly intact, and I couldn't help but chuckle at the sight. Hold on, I whispered. Let me help you with that. I peeled the shell off and placed the white egg back in front of her. The little girl's eyes went wide as saucers. It really was a hard-boiled egg, but it was massive, over 30 feet long. Gao Yang couldn't believe her eyes. She lunged at it and took a massive bite. The egg was snow-white and looked delicious. The aroma was incredible, the kind of luxury only a high-ranking noble could afford. And now, there was one so big she could eat as much as she wanted. Thank you, she whispered. Gao Yang tore a huge hole in the egg with just a few bites. She broke through the white and reached the yolk inside. She buried her head in the egg, devouring the yolk with desperate hunger. Sounds of pure satisfaction escaped her lips. Watching her eat so happily made me feel good too. I was glad I could finally help this poor girl. But then I realized, was the egg I gave her a little too big? There was no way she could finish it all. Besides, in this sweltering July heat, if it sits out all night, it'll rot and become inedible. It would be a total waste of food. As I was thinking that, the girl lifted her head and spoke in a timid voice. Can I call the villagers to come and eat? Friend, I can't finish this alone, and by tomorrow it will rot. Fine by me, call everyone over. Gao Yang knelt down and bowed deeply. Thank you, Heavenly God. Now that she was full and had her strength back, she went sprinting toward the village. It didn't take long for the news to spread like wildfire. All 42 villagers gathered around the massive hard-boiled egg. They stood before it like they were standing in front of a small house. If it weren't for the hole showing the bright yellow yolk inside, they never would have believed this was actually an egg. Old Man Gao, the village chief, stood at the very front. His face was a mask of pure confusion and doubt. You're saying the Heavenly God gave us this giant egg? Gao Yang nodded and pointed to the sky. He's the one who saved us from the bandits yesterday. The villagers looked at each other, the memories of yesterday still fresh in their minds. That lawless band of ruthless bandits, crushed into the dirt by an invisible, divine pressure. Blood had splattered everywhere. The scene was so shocking it was almost impossible to believe it had really happened. Only Gao Yang saw what I did next. She told the village she had seen a heavenly god. A god who reached down from the clouds to crush the bandits. I had ended them in one strike, but no one else witnessed it. Naturally, the villagers didn't know whether to believe her. They never expected that just one day later, Gao Yang would return with an egg of this impossible size. She told them I was the one who gave it to her. Staring at the house-sized egg, the village chief let out a long sigh. Only a heavenly god could provide something like this. No mortal could ever find such a thing on their own. Even if it existed, no pot on earth is big enough to cook it. The others nodded. Gao Yang, it seems the heavenly god. favors you. He only shows his divinity to you. Gao Yang was stunned by the realization. The heavenly god favors me? The chief nodded. Did he give you any other instructions? Gao Yang nodded quickly. He told me to call everyone over to share in this divine feast. Since it is a gift from the heavenly god himself, let's eat it, but don't fight over it. Everyone gets a large portion. Take your share and go. I don't know what to do with the rest. The village chief finished distributing the food quickly, but there was so much left over that the villagers couldn't carry it all. I realized that if this thing stayed in the village and rotted, it would be a disaster. I reached my hand into the observation box to pick up the leftovers. I tossed the remaining pieces back toward my own side. The villagers watched in awe as the rest of the egg flew into the sky. Gao Yang was so terrified she nearly fainted, kneeling on the ground in worship. She looked at the heavens, thanking me for my divine blessings. She truly believed I was a god. Slowly, the miniature landscape village finally regained its calm. The little people began their search for food once again, even though they had just finished a massive feast. Cooked eggs don't last long, and soon they would be hungry again. They were already starting to worry about how they would survive tomorrow. I sat in front of the box, watching them in silence with a heavy heart. One egg was enough for now, but I couldn't just give them eggs every day. They need a balanced diet. I'll have to give them rice and vegetables too. They need meat every now and then, and they definitely need salt. Humans can't survive without salt, and these little people are still human, right? Feeding 42 people is starting to feel like I'm raising a box of hamsters. It's only going to cost me a few yuan a month to keep them alive. It's not that I can't afford it, I just need to know what I'm doing. I opened a search engine to look up how to raise people in a miniature country. No results. I gave up and headed back to the history and military forums I frequent. I posted an anonymous question. If you had a group of miniature people, what would you do? The first reply said, if there are tiny women, I'd lift their skirts every day. Another one chimed in, not bad. I'd watch them bathe every single day. I was speechless. What a bunch of idiots. I'll have to figure this out on my own. I took one last look at the landscape box to make sure they were okay for now. Then I ran out the door and rushed to the supermarket for over an hour. I hauled my haul back home. I bought a whole sack of rice, 2 slabs of pork, and a big bag of vegetables. I even grabbed a massive bag of salt, spending over 100 yuan in total. Once I got back to the house, I leaned over the box and counted all 42 of them, not a single one missing. They were still hard at work, desperately searching for their next meal. I looked down at them, and suddenly, a mischievous idea popped into my head. I grabbed the sack of rice and scooped up a massive handful. I wanted to see the look on their faces when they found a literal mountain of food. I located the little girl's house in the village and cupped my hand like a funnel. I aimed right for her window and started to pour. Slowly, grain by grain, I let the rice stream into her home. Once the room was half full, I pulled back and waited happily for her to return. She's going to be thrilled when she sees all this food. Meanwhile, Sun Yaowu, the county magistrate, sat in his main hall. He was reviewing the account books his secretary had just handed over. His brow was furrowed deep in frustration. The back taxes from the villages still hadn't been collected. His superiors were breathing down his neck, demanding results. The secretary let out a forced, nervous smile. My lord, there is a massive drought in Anzi, he pleaded. Thousands of miles of land are barren, and the people have nothing to live on. These peasants truly have no food left to give. But the magistrate wasn't buying it for a second. Nonsense, he snapped. Those wretches always have something hidden away. They're just hoarding it because they don't want to pay their rent. The secretary looked down, his face flushed with shame. There is a drought now, and there was a drought last year, he muttered. Last time they managed to scrape by, but this year, they have nothing left. During the first year of the drought, everyone still had their food reserves. By the second year, they were melting down their pots and selling family heirlooms just to pay. Now, in the third year of this endless heat, people are literally dying of hunger. Sun Yaowu narrowed his eyes and glared at his subordinate. Are you actually taking the side of those wretches? He hissed. How much are they paying you to whisper this nonsense in my ear? The secretary trembled, his voice shaking as he replied. My lord, I haven't taken a single cent from them, I swear. They can't even afford to eat. Where would they get bribe money? I am only speaking up because my conscience won't let me stay silent. Sun Yaowu let out a cold, mocking snort. He ignored the secretary and turned toward the guards standing by the door. You there? Organize a team and go to the village to demand the taxes immediately. Remember, those peasants love to cry and moan about being poor. They hide their grain under the floorboards while refusing to pay their dues. If they give you any trouble, don't hesitate to use force. Violence is the only language those miserable rats understand. You must be ruthless and beat them into submission. Suddenly, a bailiff kicks the door open with a violent crash. The advisor jumps in fright, looking at His Excellency. Please, don't do this. The people are already suffering so much. If we push them like this, we risk inciting a full-scale rebellion. A peasant revolt born from desperation is a fire we can't put out. Enough. Get out of here. I'm sick of your weak-minded whining. Meanwhile, Gao Yiya drags his exhausted body back home. He finally reaches Gaojia village, stumbling through the dusty streets. He unlatches his door, and a mountain of rice spills out. Massive, oval-shaped white grains, each over 5 feet long. Each single grain is nearly 2 feet wide. He collapses under the sheer shock of the sight. He stays there for a moment, completely paralyzed. He stares around the room in a daze. Rice, everywhere. He's never seen rice this big. He can't wrap his head around it. Then, looking up at the sky, I let my face appear faintly through the clouds with a smile. A second later, I pull back and vanish into the mist again. Soon, all 42 villagers gather in front of Gao Yuya's house. They all stare at the massive white rice, each grain as big as a grinding stone. The villagers are completely lost in a fog of confusion. They stand there, paralyzed, unable to process what they're seeing. The village chief finally speaks. This must be another gift from the great god. Rice this massive simply doesn't exist in our world. Gao Yuya nods, realizing the great god played a little trick on him. I filled his house with so much rice it nearly buried him when he opened the door. The chief sighs. I wish the god would play a joke like that on me every day. Gao Zhou steps forward and tries to wrap his arms around a single grain. He grunts with the effort, his face turning red. So how do we split this up? Should we take some for each family? The village chief immediately snaps at him to stop. We don't know if this rice is just for Yuya or for all of us. If we take it without permission, we might enrage the great god. Do you want him to turn you into a bloody pulp like those bandits? Gao Zhou turns pale and instantly lets go of the grain. The massive rice grain hits the floor with a heavy thud. The chief turns to Gao Yuya, his voice dropping to a respectful whisper. You're a good lad, and the great god chose to appear only to you. We can only ask that you speak to the great god on our behalf. Ask him if we can share in your luck and use some of this divine grain. Just as the chief was saying he couldn't go on like this, a voice suddenly echoed from the village entrance. You filthy peasants of Gaojia village, get out here, you bunch of idiots hiding in your holes. Stop playing dead, you owe taxes to the court. When are you going to pay up? The moment those words hit the air, every villager's face went pale. Even the small children, who didn't understand, were terrified and covered their mouths. No one dared to make a sound, not even a cry. Gao Zhou lowered his voice, trembling. This is bad. The county bailiffs are here. The village chief immediately snapped into action. Run, Sigu and the rest of you young men. Hurry, hide all this rice and I'll. Listen, lock the door tight. I'll go to the bridge entrance. I'll deal with the bailiffs myself. Whatever you do, don't let them see the rice in this house. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Meanwhile, I was standing right next to the landscape box. I suddenly noticed 5 new tiny officials had appeared inside the box. A second later, I saw these 5 newcomers getting into a heated argument with the villagers. They were tiny, but their gestures were aggressive and arrogant. I leaned in closer to get a better look. I pressed my ear to the box and heard one official scream. Commoners, you've owed taxes for ages and refused to pay. Another official brandished an iron ruler, shouting, if you don't pay, I'm dragging you all to jail. The village chief approached with a forced smile. But sir, it's not that we don't want to pay. It's just that we truly have no money and no food left. We're all going to starve. Look at the sky. Not a single drop of rain has fallen in months. The crops out in the fields are all dead. The lead official just sneered at him. Drought is no excuse. The court's tax must be paid in full, no matter what. Anything less is rebellion. The chief's face fell, looking like he was at a funeral. Sirs, look at our people. Every single person in this village is thin and jaundiced. They'd collapse from the slightest breeze. Do we look like we have money? We're starving. It's impossible to pay. The tax? You bunch of bastards. I'm searching this village for food myself. Right now, if I find your hiding grain, you'll pay for it with your lives. He shoved the old village chief aside. Then he went strutting into the village like he owned the place. Watching this scene made my blood start to boil. It was a classic case of corrupt officials oppressing the weak. A strange, incomparable feeling washed over me. This box was far more than I imagined. Something was drawing me in. I knew this wasn't the end. I watched as the tiny officials began ransacking the village. The village chief's expression turned to one of pure despair. The commoners' houses weren't worth searching. Nobody had a single scrap of food left anyway. But Gao Ye's house was a different story. It was half filled with inkstones and bags of rice. If the officials found that stash, it was all over. But the more nervous he got, the more he stood out. The tiny officials noticed the shift in the air immediately. The villagers' eyes kept drifting, intentionally or not, toward one specific ruined hut. It was as if something unspeakable was hidden inside that shack. All the young men of the village were guarding it, standing back to back. They pressed their weight against the door, terrified of what might happen if it opened. The officials' attention locked onto that hut like predators. One of the small officers marched straight toward Gao Ye's house. The young men, standing guard, looked like they were ready to snap. Every villager there became visibly tense. Their expressions shifted from fear to pure desperation. The village chief couldn't help himself and rushed forward. He threw himself directly in the path of the approaching officials. Please, sirs, there's nothing in there, he pleaded. Move, the official barked, shoving the old man with all his might. The chief stumbled and collapsed onto the dirt. The officials charged the house, screaming at the young men to get out of the way. Several young men had already been cut down by the officers. The survivors clenched their fists, but none of them dared to strike back. Still, they refused to move, so the lead official delivered a brutal blow. He kicked them aside, and the wooden door was torn right off its hinges. The barrier gave way, and the rice stored inside immediately came spilling out. The officials standing at the front of the group marched into the room. He recoiled in pure shock the moment he saw the massive grains of rice. Each one was as large and heavy as a solid inkstone. He stood there frozen, and the other 4 officials were just as stunned. Their mouths hung open in disbelief as the entire scene fell into a trance. An eerie silence gripped the village for several long seconds. "What on earth is this?" one stammered. "Gao village is hiding this?" It was rice, but it defied all logic. "How is it so big?" they whispered, looking toward the village chief. The chief stood tall and declared, "The God of Heaven gave this to save our lives. If you dare to touch a single grain, the God of Heaven will strike you down." He warned them that their lives would be forfeit. The officials exchanged nervous glances, caught between greed and terror. The standoff froze in time for nearly a minute. I watched the tiny figures in silence, wondering if I should intervene. If I want to protect my 42 little subjects, I have to decide. I should act now and crush these 5 new officials. I'll break them just like I crushed those bandits last time. But I hesitated. Where did these 5 men even come from? How did they get inside the box? Is there another entrance? If more of them show up later, I'll need to be ready for anything. Acting too quickly might not be the smartest move right now. I kept a close eye on the box, waiting for the right moment. After weighing my options, I finally made a choice. I snapped a photo with my phone and hovered my hand over the box. If my tiny people are in mortal danger, I won't hesitate. I'm prepared to reach in and end these 5 intruders. I'll slaughter them like the dogs they are, just like those bandits. Down below, the villagers saw my massive hand appearing in the sky. Gao Yy began to panic the moment he saw the shadow. He knew exactly what the God of Heaven's raised hand meant. He remembered how I turned those bandits into a bloody pulp with one slap. That image was both terrifying and deeply satisfying. The memory of that carnage was still fresh. It kept playing over and over in my mind. Gao Yuan quickly raised her head and screamed at the sky. "God of Heaven, I beg of you, please don't kill them. They are officials. If you kill them, our entire world is doomed. Our village will be finished." The 5 officials stood there, completely stunned by her outburst. They looked at each other in confusion and then slowly raised their eyes. All 5 of them stared up at the empty sky at the same time. They thought, is this villager really screaming at the clouds not to kill us? Is there something up there that can actually hurt us? We don't see a thing. The sky above them remained vast and silent. They weren't stupid. They remembered what the village chief had warned them earlier. But a second later, the head official let out a cold sneer. He cursed under his breath. What kind of pathetic mystery is this? Another official joined in the mockery, calling it a ridiculous whim. Do they really think something is coming to kill us? These peasants are just acting. One official barked at Gao Yuan. "What are you screaming for, you little brat?" Intimidating officials is the same as opposing the imperial court itself. She cried back. "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to save your lives. You need to leave right now. Hurry, the God of Heaven has already raised his hand. You've irritated him. If this continues, he will crush everything." With one slap, the official from the capital would be gone. The head official barked, "Seize that woman. She's a liar. Take her to the station. We'll interrogate her slowly. She might be a demon, or a spy from the White Lotus sect." One official brandished his weapon. He gripped an iron rod and stepped slowly toward Gao Yuan. Gao Yuan stared at the official as he closed in. She retreated toward the house, trembling. I looked down as the clouds parted and my hand began to move. I lowered my hand quickly, positioning it right over the girl's head. To the official, it was clear that the God of Heaven was watching. I was protecting her, but I hesitated when looking at the officials. If I attacked, I would crush him with a single slap. I'd reduce that official to a pulp, but these men weren't common bandits. Killing a bandit is simple. You dig a hole, throw them in, and it's over. But the death of an official in Gao village would have grave consequences. The government would assume the villagers had revolted. The entire village would be labeled as outlaws and hunted down. They'd be branded as rebels, and a massive conquering army would come to suppress them, leaving everyone dead. Gao Yuan didn't care about politics as she faced the official. She lowered her hand, realizing she was powerless to stop him. She lifted her head to the sky and kept screaming for help. Hearing her cry, I realized these 5 men represented a much larger force. This landscape box is definitely not as simple as it looks. I decided to do exactly what the girl wanted. I pulled back the hand that was about to crush the official. Instead, I reached in to pluck him out like a weed. I extended 2 fingers to gently pinch the official's body. I had him right where I wanted him. The official let out a high-pitched squeal like a slaughtered pig. He felt a massive force pinching his shoulders, crushing his bones. He was nearly disjointed right then and there. He looked left and right, trying to see what was grabbing him, but there was nothing around him, only the grip of an invisible force. The other 4 officials looked up at their comrade dangling in midair. The villagers saw the miracle and fell to their knees in unison. God has manifested. The official had been snatched up by the heavens. Dangling there in midair, the man was so terrified that he actually wet himself. He flailed his limbs, screaming at the top of his lungs, "God have mercy. I didn't mean to offend you." The other 4 officials stared at each other, paralyzed and confused. I puffed out my cheeks and blew a sharp gust of air toward them. A violent, localized gale erupted instantly. The wind was targeted and fierce, hitting only those 4 men with pinpoint accuracy. The force of my breath was overwhelming. It swept them off their feet like dry leaves in a storm. They were hurled backward, flying nearly 4 meters through the air. They hit the dirt with a heavy, sickening thud. Their bones groaned under the impact as they scrambled to their senses. Finally, they understood exactly what they had to do. They scrambled to their feet as fast as their shaking legs allowed. Then they threw themselves back down, slamming their foreheads into the dirt. I wanted them gone, and I wanted them to keep their mouths shut about this. Gao Yuanyuan looked up and shouted with everything she had. The heavenly god commands you to leave. Do not speak a word of his presence. The 4 officials bowed frantically, desperate to obey the divine order. They scrambled up and bolted, leaving that official, Shaoxian, weeping as he dangled in the air. He begged me, "Heavenly God, have mercy. Please, let me go too. I won't say a single word about what happened here." I opened my hand and let him go. The official plummeted from the height of a giant. He slammed hard onto the street below. Groaning in pain, he forced himself up and began limping away. He struggled to catch up with his 4 colleagues as I watched them flee. I followed the 5 of them with my eyes as they stumbled out of Zhaoying village. They looked like pathetic wrecks as they hurried toward the city of Tlalpan. Soon, they reached the very edge of the village territory. They passed right through the glass wall and vanished, as if it were a portal to another world. I had just witnessed these tiny people from the outside world entering and leaving my box. I paused, falling into deep thought about what this actually meant. This box wasn't just a habitat for 42 people. It was a gateway to an entire world. A world full of these tiny people. I used to think I was just keeping them like a cage of hamsters. But if I'm looking down at a whole civilization, there is so much more to investigate. I shifted my focus back down toward the little villagers. At that moment, the village elders and leaders were all gathered together. The officials had fled, and the tiny villagers were finally gathering together. They began prostrating themselves toward the sky in worship. The young woman, being the only one able to speak with me, was surrounded by them. The little villagers were all shouting questions at her at once. Then, she slowly lifted her head toward the clouds. She cried out, "Heavenly God, the villagers thank you for your divine aid. They all have one more thing they wish to ask you. Is this divine rice meant for only one person, or can the whole village eat it?" I fixed my gaze on the girl, realizing she was my only bridge to this world. She can hear me, which means I can learn everything about these tiny people through her. It was time to give this young lady a proper answer. I leaned in and said, "Share the divine rice with everyone. Furthermore, I have several questions I need you to answer for me." I needed to know exactly what kind of world I was looking at. The girl and the others were overjoyed, shouting, "The god has spoken. These delicacies are a reward for us all." The villagers immediately burst into cheers, yelling, "May the god protect us." They chanted, "Long live the god," until the girls signaled for them to be quiet. Gao Yingying shouted at the top of her lungs, "Silence, everyone. The god has more questions for me." As soon as her voice rang out, the entire village fell into a dead hush. I looked down at them and wondered, what kind of world is this really? I asked which continent they were on, but Gao Yingying didn't understand. She simply repeated the word back to me with a confused look. She asked the other tiny villagers, but none of them knew what it meant either. Not a single person present could make sense of my question. Even the village elder, the man who had seen more of the world than anyone, looked completely and utterly lost. What is a planet? Their blank expressions told me they had no clue. They had never even heard those words before. I realized that while their culture matched mine, their knowledge was centuries behind. I tried a different approach. What country are you in? Even the concept of a nation seemed to be a stretch for them. They had a vague idea that they weren't just living in a vacuum. They understood they lived within the borders of a kingdom. They knew there was a royal court and an army somewhere out there, but they had no idea what the country was called or what era they were in. They all shook their heads in unison, looking up at me helplessly. I frowned, thinking, these people don't even know what country they belong to. They didn't even know the date. They were completely illiterate. I expected a high-level conversation, but reality was hitting me hard. It made sense, though. Ancient peasants rarely knew anything beyond their own fields. They never left their village, with the county seat being the furthest they'd ever gone. They were completely ignorant of the outside world, so I let out a long sigh. I realized I couldn't learn anything from them, and the tiny villagers just stared at each other. Gao Yingying lowered her voice and whispered to her people. She told them, "The god seems very disappointed in us." The village chief looked helpless and admitted they simply couldn't answer my questions. He thought hard and told her, "Ask God to give us some time to find a solution." Their plan was to find someone educated. But an educated person? There was no one like that here. The chief confirmed there was no one learned in their village. However, he knew of someone in the county seat. The wisest man he knew was the county magistrate, but Gao Yingying shook her head. The chief asked how they could possibly invite a magistrate, then suggested another way. He proposed inviting Master Xian for their project, but Gao Yingying shook her head again. She insisted they couldn't involve him, making the village chief chuckle dryly. Unfortunately, the man in charge of the project was also a big figure, unlike Master Xian. He was followed by officials daily, making it much harder to reach him. It wouldn't be easy to invite him, so the chief shook his head and looked at a young man nearby. He called out to Gao Chuo, who stepped forward with a foolish grin. The village chief ordered him to bring the man back to the village tomorrow morning. Take some of the village youths with you, eat your fill of white rice, and get strong. You're going to take a little trip into the city. Invite the scribe to Gao village. If he's willing, bring him back with respect. If he refuses, knock him out with a club and carry him back on your shoulders. The God of Heaven gave us our lives, and we must provide whatever he demands. We cannot disappoint him, and Gao Chuo just stood there with his mouth wide open. He looked stunned. The God of Heaven rewarded me with a massive egg, he muttered. He gave me white rice too, so I'll do exactly what he says. The village chief waved his hand and ordered the rice to be distributed to everyone. 42 villagers gathered together. They crowded around Gao Yingying's house. I watched as they handed out 10 grains of my white rice, each the size of a boulder to them. Each person received a portion the size of an inkstone, enough to last a long time. A single grain could feed an entire family for several days. Even after all 41 people took their share, a massive pile remained in Gao Yingying's home. Dozens of grains were left, but no one dared to complain that she kept the most. To these superstitious villagers, Gao Yingying was now a holy saint. She was sacred and untouchable, and soon, every house began boiling water for the rice. Since the grains were the size of inkstones, they had to cook them one piece at a time. First, they had to break the grains apart. Cooking just a dozen small fragments of my rice was more than enough. It could feed an entire family, but eating pure white rice until they were full, that was a luxury they couldn't fathom, so they only cooked half of what they needed. They mixed it with wild greens, tree bark, and bitter roots to stretch the meal. One serving of white rice was transformed into 2. I grabbed my magnifying glass and peered through their tiny windows. I watched the messy sludge they were boiling in their pots. It made me angry, and I couldn't help but shake my head in frustration. I gave them plenty of food, yet here they were, cooking garbage. How are their bodies supposed to get healthy like that? If they keep eating that junk, they'll never recover. I decided to add something else to the box while they weren't looking. I thought about grabbing a piece of pork and dropping it into the landscape, right into the middle of the diorama. But then I stopped myself. These people have been starving for a long time. Giving a massive dose of fat to a malnourished body is a recipe for disaster. Severe diarrhea could actually kill them in their weakened state. I told myself to take it slow, one step at a time. I had to fix their diet gradually. For a while, everyone in the village ate the exact same thing, and the atmosphere finally started to shift back. The village felt alive again, and it had been ages since they tasted rice this good. The village chief sat by his door, savoring the aroma of the divine rice. To him, this was nothing short of a miracle from God. One young man grabbed a large bowl and began eating like a starved animal. He was big and strong, so he needed much more than the others. While other families shared a dozen broken grains of rice, he shoveled his portion down his throat all by himself, acting as if he hadn't eaten in several lifetimes. It was almost scary to watch him bolt it down, but Gao YY sat alone, lost in thought. She sat on the threshold, eating slowly and deliberately. It took her forever just to finish one bite, and as she chewed, she began to cry. She whispered to her late mother, "I'm so sorry you aren't here to enjoy this." Night began to fall over the landscape, and the tiny villagers headed to bed. They retreated into their small houses to rest for the night. I finally pulled my attention away from the diorama box. I took a long stretch, turned on my phone, and opened an app. I went to the history and military forum I frequent and posted the photo anonymously. I asked the users to look at the village, Gao YY, and the 5 officials. I wanted to know what they thought of the clothing and the officials' uniforms. The style looked exactly like the Yamen officials from the Ming dynasty. Even if the exact year was unclear, the craftsmanship of this diorama box was incredible. It perfectly captured a scene of Ming dynasty officials extorting honest people. The replies started rolling in, and the level of detail surprised me more and more. I logged the date, July 13th, 2023. Location, Siaswakwin City. By morning, the heat had already spiked to 33 degrees, threatening to be a scorcher. I rolled out of bed half asleep and immediately checked the landscape box. I had moved it from the living room to right next to my computer desk. I wanted it close enough to monitor with a single glance. Everything inside seemed fine. The tiny people were already awake and active. Gao YY was leading a group of young villagers through a hearty breakfast. They needed the energy because they were heading to the city to consult a scribe. The rest of the villagers grabbed their bamboo baskets and prepared to head out. I watched them closely, fascinated by their tiny, determined movements. They were heading out to forage for wild vegetables, bark, and roots. Nothing has changed yet, but I guess I can understand why. To survive, they've had to stay as close to power as possible. How could they think of anything else? I need to start feeding them today. As long as I feed them every day, their constant anxiety will fade. That desperate fear for their own survival will vanish. Once that's gone, they'll finally have the capacity to relax. They'll have the peace of mind to think about other things. It was time for a little divine intervention. I opened the fridge and pulled out a fresh leaf. It was a piece of Chinese cabbage I bought yesterday, and it was massive. It measured at least 40 centimeters long and about 10 centimeters wide. I walked back to the diorama and delicately placed the leaf in front of Gao YY. At that moment, Gao YY was grabbing a bamboo basket to go forage. Suddenly, my hand reached down from the sky and dropped the giant leaf before her. To someone her size, this thing was a monolith. The cabbage leaf stretched 35 meters long in her world. It was wide enough to cover a whole path. I watched as my offering fell from the heavens right in front of her. Gao Weiwei jumped back in shock at first, but she calmed down quickly. After all, it wasn't the first time the sky god had provided for her. It's not like the beginning anymore, when I felt like there was nothing I could do. Back then, I was just a man staring at a giant egg in a box, completely stunned. Now, I watch as Gao Weiwei drops to her knees, looking absolutely enchanted. She bows toward the sky and shouts her thanks for the sky god's favor. She clears her throat, composes herself, and stands back up with purpose. She lets out a loud cry, calling everyone in the village to gather round. The sky god has blessed us with food once again, she proclaims. The villagers stop in their tracks. They were all holding their bamboo baskets, ready to head out for a long day of foraging. But this massive, emerald green leaf sitting in the dirt changes everything. The sheer scale of the offering leaves them momentarily paralyzed with awe. But they've already been through the baptism of the giant egg and the massive rice grains. Their shock doesn't last long this time. They've learned to accept my miracles. As the sun begins to set, the village comes alive with activity. Under the village chief's direction, they begin to harvest the giant cabbage leaf together. They work systematically, carving out a generous portion for every single person. Every family gets their share of the divine bounty. Everything is going exactly as I planned for Gao Weiwei and her people. By the next morning, the desperate rush to find wild greens has stopped. When hunger is no longer the only thought in their heads, they can finally start to live. When you're not starving, you finally have time for other worries. The villagers immediately begin to show what they're truly capable of. They start focusing on the variety of their daily lives. Your pants have been torn for days, one says. Go on now. My mother will fix them for you. I watch as Li Daoxian finds a middle-aged woman with a real talent. She's a master of sewing, practically a professional. She doesn't have any advanced tools, just a pair of scissors and a needle. And yet, she manages to stitch together beautiful clothes out of rough, coarse cloth for her son. How do you want me to make these? Another asks, pointing to water jars. They need vessels for their water. I dug up a massive chunk of yellow clay just for this. Teach me how to turn this into a jar. Li Daoxian sends two middle-aged men to start working the mud. One of them actually knows the craft, and his skill is formidable. In an instant, he transforms a lump of yellow clay into a perfect vessel. The other man tries to mimic him clumsily, making a mess of it for a while. Now, I turn my gaze back toward the sky. I shift my focus to the other side of the village. Even the village chief has a hidden talent. He cuts a pile of bamboo rods and weaves two perfect baskets in a flash. The craftsmanship is honestly magnificent. My axe is getting dull, a villager says. Can you help me sharpen it? Li Daoxian turns his gaze toward a specific man. He looks at a blacksmith named Gao Jiki. The rhythmic clinking of his hammer against the metal is almost hypnotic. Once he's finished, the axe looks incredibly easy to handle. It looks brand new. There's so much to see inside this landscape box that I'm completely captivated. Wait, it looks like I'm about to witness something interesting. I notice Gao Yuanyuan drawing water from the well. She carries a heavy bucket back to her house, pours it into a large wooden basin, and shuts the doors and windows tight. Suddenly, it clicks. I realize this is exactly what those bored guys on the forums were talking about. It's happening. The young woman is going to use that water to wash her body, and my heart starts racing at the thought. My heart starts pounding against my chest for no reason. I shift my grip on the magnifying glass in my hand. I look down at Gao Yuanyuan's dilapidated house in awe. There are holes everywhere, especially in the roof. After 3 years of drought and no rain, nobody cares if the roof is falling apart. There's a massive gap right there that lets me see straight inside. If I aim my magnifying glass at that hole, I can see everything. I hesitate for a second, but I'm only human. I peer through the opening. It's like a view from the heavens. I can't help but feel grateful, truly grateful, incredibly grateful, so very grateful, deeply grateful, beyond grateful. The way a man looks at the world is just different. Our paths crossed again in this strange situation. The atmosphere between us shifts with every exchange. Even amidst all her fears, our eyes met. After a few seconds, Gao Yuanyuan looked away. She didn't dare look a heavenly god in the eye, and her dirty little face suddenly flushed. The blush was so deep it couldn't even be hidden by the grime on her skin. It took over her entire face. Her skin turned a bright, burning red, a dark crimson, but she was just too small, not even an inch tall. If I wasn't using this magnifying glass, I wouldn't be able to see her at all. I wouldn't catch her expression, let alone the trace of her reaction. Overcome with shyness, Gao Yuanyuan threw the door open and bolted. She ran straight toward the village chief and leaned in close. She lowered her voice to a whisper I surely wasn't meant to hear and said, "Grandpa Chief, I have to ask you something, Chief." She paused, breathless. Gao Yuanyuan's face was as red as a piece of raw liver. That heavenly god up there, he seems to be staring at me from the sky this whole time. The chief looked up, thinking of the god he worshipped. The heavenly god favors you and watches over you constantly. He watches from the very heavens. He works through your hands. And he speaks his divine decrees through your mouth. You should be grateful. So why do you have that strange look on your face? I watched them, thinking about how much she had to be thankful for. So that was the problem. She was grateful, truly grateful. But something was wrong. She wasn't thinking about who she owed her life to or how her life had changed. She just needed clean clothes and a place to wash up. The chief continued, What if? What if the day comes when the heavenly God needs you to serve him? You must obey him meekly. Back then, the common folk held many strange beliefs. Some sects demanded that women serve the gods directly. It was a common practice, though real gods were hard to find. Those women never knew a moment of peace. They serve with their bodies, acting as nothing more than monks. Those who speak for God are often just monsters and spirits. Don't mock the ancients. Things like that still happen today, as Gao Weiwei listened to the chief and left. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized the heavenly God had saved her life. He gives me food, so I need to find a way to serve him. Inside her mind, she pictured the young, handsome face of the heavenly God. She immediately tried to shake the image away. Oh heavens, what am I thinking? This is far too indecent. Back at the house, she looked up at the hole in the roof and stopped worrying about money. She abandoned the idea of covering that hole entirely. If the heavenly God wants to watch, let him watch. My life belongs to him now. What is there that I can't show him? She began to undress. Her hands trembled as she shed her clothes, leaving her dirty body exposed on the bed. It had been far too long since she had seen another person. I hadn't bathed in forever, and the coarse sand was everywhere. The grime had practically solidified against my skin. Layer upon layer of filth wrapped around me. I mocked myself, thinking my body really wasn't much to look at. She had no idea that I, Li Daoxian, had already pulled the magnifying glass away. If that young woman hadn't discovered me first, who knows what I would have seen. At first, I realized the communication between us was a two-way street. I could have easily become a voyeur, but I caught myself just in time. A normal person wouldn't just stand there and watch. I didn't have the nerve to take a second look. So I quickly averted my eyes and looked toward the edge of the box. I wondered what had happened to the little people who left in the car. What was their situation like right now? The problem was, once they left the landscape box, I could no longer see them. I couldn't look out for them anymore either. What would happen if they died out there? Outside the box, it was the era of Emperor Chongzhen. In 1627, the Great Famine of the Tianqi era was spreading across the land. Carrying the sacred dice, Gao Zhugu led the group toward the city. He took 3 young men from the Gao family with him, heading straight for the county gates as simple peasants. They had never left their village in over 30 years. Their entire journey depended on asking strangers for directions. Whenever they saw someone on the road, they would stop to ask, though they still took the wrong path several times. They kept doubling back and asking again until they finally reached the gate. By the time they reached the county, the sun was high in the sky, high noon. It was the peak of the heat, the kind of sweltering day that never lets up. The temperature outside was pushing 104 degrees. The 4 young men were sweating like dogs, heads hanging low and spirits broken, when one whispered, "Fifth brother, we have to find the master. We have to get to the site. But I'm terrified of the county officials. I heard the previous master used to eat people alive. He wouldn't even spit out the bones. They say these officials eat people the same way." That terrace was the only thing I actually liked about the view. The 3 young men were absolutely paralyzed with fear. Gao Zhugu was just as terrified, a peasant who had never traveled more than 3 miles from home. This was his first time ever stepping foot into the county seat. He was already shaking. The sight of the massive mansions in the city center overwhelmed him. His entire body trembled as he reached out his hand. He felt for his bag of dry rations, pinching the tiny fragments of rice inside. The village chief had given them this, wrapped in cloth, before they left. Just a few handfuls of broken rice packed tightly into a bag. Touching that bag was the only thing that calmed his nerves. I thought, what is there to fear? We have the Lord God watching over us. The 3 young men stood there, speechless, after hearing those words. Just the name of the Lord God was enough to steady them. They found a spark of courage and finally marched out of Tianfu. They stopped everyone they met to ask for directions. Following the locals' guidance, they finally reached the gates of the county yamen. As soon as they arrived at the entrance, they saw a crowd gathered there. The scene was completely chaotic. A middle-aged man with a pale, clean-shaven face was making a scene. He was slightly stout, with his hair disheveled and hanging loose. He wore a long coat and was wailing in front of the government office. "Lord Magistrate, I beg of you, do not dismiss this humble servant. I have dedicated my life to you, doing everything in my power. How can you just say you don't want me anymore? This is a betrayal. You're killing the hound now that the rabbit is caught," he screamed. His expression was exaggerated, looking like a total fool. The guard at the gate just shook his head in disgust. "Third Lord, stop crying." The magistrate was very clear. "If he doesn't want you, he doesn't want you. Screaming won't help." Gao Chaohu's eyes lit up as he whispered, "Did you hear that? They called him Third Lord." I realized this had to be the man they were looking for, the magistrate's advisor, Shang Shir. The other 3 young men watched in shock as the high-ranking advisor sobbed on the ground. It was pathetic. The magistrate had clearly discarded him like trash. But Gao Chaohu didn't care about the drama. He just knew he needed him. He signaled the others, "Stay close. Keep your eyes on that guy." I watched as Shang Shir finally gave up and slunk away into a side alley. "Let's move," Gao Chaohu muttered, pulling a heavy wooden club from behind his back. He had scavenged the weapon on the road into the city, just in case. Back at the yamen, Shang Shitra's final screams for mercy had fallen on deaf ears. The magistrate was done with him, and the guards were even more fed up. The head bailiff, who had hated the advisor for years, didn't hold back. No matter how much the man wailed, the bailiff didn't flinch. He ordered 2 officers to beat Shangshir until his face was a map of dark bruises. Battered and swollen, the advisor finally realized the magistrate's decision was final. He let out a long, defeated sigh and limped away from the government office. He wandered down the main street for a while, head hanging in shame. Then, he ducked into a narrow, secluded alleyway. He was trying to take a shortcut home, but he didn't know he was being hunted. He had only taken a few steps when a young man blocked his path, gripping a massive wooden club. Shangshir panicked and spun around, desperate to make a run for it. He tried to sprint back the way he came, but his heart sank. 3 more young men were standing there, blocking the alley entrance. Terror gripped him as his eyes darted between the 4 figures. He realized it instantly. These were 4 desperate, poor men. He threw his hands up and shrieked, "Don't hit me, please. I'm on your side. It's the magistrate who's forcing those insane taxes. I had nothing to do with it. I was always trying to talk him out of it. I begged him to lower the rates. I was advocating for the people." Gao Xiaohu let out a soft, cold laugh. "Is that how it happened?" Shangshir nodded frantically. "Yes, I spoke up for you. I put my neck on the line for all of you. That's the only reason I was kicked out of the office. I challenged his power to protect you, and now he's fired me." Gao Xiaohu scratched his head, looking unconvinced. "I don't really follow all that, but you sure sound like an educated man." "I am. I'm a scholar," Shangshir cried. "You can't be so rude to a man of my status. Put those clubs down right now. We should talk this out like gentlemen. In my circles, we call this a civilized discussion." Gao Xiaohu just smiled, and I knew exactly what was coming next. I watched the scene unfold and thought, well, isn't that nice? A scholar is exactly the kind of guest we want to invite, Gao said with a grin. "So please, Shangshir, come with us to Gaojia village." Shangshir stammered. What kind of place is Gaojia village? I'm not going anywhere. I refuse to step foot in those slums." A loud crack echoed through the alley as a wooden club slammed into the back of his head. He didn't even have time to groan before he collapsed into the dirt. The young villager behind him lowered his club and muttered, "I just had to hit him. Every time he opens his mouth, I can't understand a word of that fancy nonsense." Gao Xiaohu laughed and said, "To be honest, I wanted to hit him too." 2 of them hoisted the unconscious scholar up and moved toward the edge of the city. But suddenly, a squad of officials appeared on the road right in front of them. The guards spotted the 4 peasants carrying a man dressed in expensive, long robes. The rich man's head hung low, clearly knocked out cold. The officer's eyes sharpened, locking onto the group immediately. It looked exactly like a kidnapping, and one officer roared, "Hey, you there! What do you think you're doing?" Gao Xiaohu and his men froze, panic surging through them instantly. They were ready to bolt, but then the lead official squinted at Gao Xiaohu's face. He recognized him from the gate yesterday. It was the same guard I had seen before. He was the same man who went to Gaojia village to collect taxes yesterday. I watched through the box, leaning in closer to see his reaction. I could have easily pinched this tiny official between 2 of my fingers. Yesterday, he was so terrified he nearly wet his pants. He hadn't slept a wink since returning, fearing a curse from the heavens. He was paralyzed with fear, convinced he'd be punished by a celestial god. He didn't even dare to leave the city gates at first. He had to drag several of his colleagues along, just to find some courage. Even now, walking the streets, he was shaking in his boots. The 4 other officials with him weren't much better. They were all huddled together, trying to look brave while dying inside. They never expected to run into the people from Gaojia village right here. They probably thought the celestial god sent these peasants to spy on them. The faces of the 5 officials turned pale as ghosts. Gao Xiaohu, just as terrified, stammered out a desperate lie. "Our friend here, he just had heat stroke. We're taking him to the river." The lead official started stammering back, waving his hands frantically. "Fine, do whatever you want. We haven't said a single word about yesterday. Not a single word to anyone." Both groups bowed deeply to each other, desperate to just get away. They practically tripped over each other in the middle of the street. As soon as they crossed the river, both groups bolted in opposite directions. The 5 officials scrambled away with their guards in tow. Gao's men didn't waste a second and started sprinting too. Both sides vanished into the distance as fast as their legs could carry them. I stared at the scene through the glass, completely stunned by the chaos. Another full day passed by, with me just ordering takeout whenever my stomach growled. Night began to fall, and the 2-story house outside my window was bathed in shadows. The last golden rays of the setting sun flickered across the room. The landscape inside the box grew dark, even though my room's fluorescent lights were on. Logically, the light from my desk lamp should have pierced right through the glass. But the box seemed to have its own rules. My world's light couldn't reach inside. The miniature world just kept getting darker. This box is full of strange mysteries. I stopped worrying about the lighting and started focusing on Gao Shou and the others. The 3 young villagers had left for the county seat at dawn and still weren't back. I just hoped nothing happened to them out there in that dangerous world. It felt like I was watching over a litter of tiny, mischievous kittens. 4 of them had wandered far from home, and as their guardian, I was restless. I couldn't help but worry if they'd make it back to the village in one piece. Just then, 5 tiny figures suddenly appeared at the very edge of the box. Seeing them return, I finally felt a wave of relief wash over me. I thought, great, they actually made it back in one piece. Gao Shou and his group were back, but they weren't alone. The man they had knocked unconscious earlier was wide awake now. He must have come to somewhere along the trek back. Now, he was being escorted by 4 fierce villagers who looked like they meant business. They were all clutching heavy wooden clubs in their hands. The prisoner didn't even dare to try and escape. He kept a close, secret watch on his 4 captors as they walked. He realized these were the same people he had encountered before. They seemed like the stubborn type you just can't reason with. I could see the fear in his eyes. If he talked too much, he'd regret it. He clearly thought, if I open my mouth, they'll crack my skull with those sticks. So he kept his mouth shut and followed them like a docile lamb. They hiked over 30 li to reach Gao village, which was no small feat. For a man who wasn't used to physical labor, it was pure torture. He hadn't eaten a single bite all day by the time they reached the village gates. By then, he was completely spent. He was gasping for air, barely able to draw a full breath. That was the state he was in when they finally entered the village. The prisoner collapsed right there on the dirt. I watched him look around and realized they had finally reached a settlement. He stammered out, Gao village? Why have you brought me here, sirs? He pleaded, you can tell me the truth now that we've arrived. Gao Shou didn't even give him a second glance. He ordered the others to guard the man while he ran toward Gao Yingying's house. He wanted to report everything to me, his divine lord, as fast as possible. But I had already seen the whole group from my view above the box. I didn't need a report, so I leaned in and spoke directly to Gao Yinying. Inside her home, Yinying had just finished dinner and was mending some old clothes. The moment my voice echoed through the room, her entire body jolted like she'd been hit by lightning. She leaped off her stool in such a hurry that her sewing kit scattered. Her needle and thread hit the floor with a dull thud. I told her, Gao Shou has brought back a prisoner. The man looks educated, so I need you to interrogate him for me. She bowed instantly and replied, I will follow your divine instructions, Lord. I gave her a final nod and said, good, get moving. Gao Shou is already at your front door. Yinying rushed to the entrance and pulled the door open just as he arrived. She pulled the door open just as Gao Shou was about to knock, his hand still raised. The door creaked inward, and Gao Shou froze in place, stammering, Yinying, how did you know? Yinying looked at him and said, the divine lord told me. He said you had returned, and that you brought back an educated man. Gao Shou looked up at the sky above his head with a terrified expression. Yinying didn't wait. She sprinted toward the village entrance at full speed. By then, word had already spread through the tiny settlement. Families were peering through their windows, whispering about what was happening at the gate. Then, everyone started coming outside. All 42 villagers, men, women, young and old, gathered at the entrance. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, jagged shadows across the village. They stood there in the fading light, hands resting on their gates. They just stared at the prisoner in total silence. The prisoner felt the crushing weight of their gaze and started to panic. Before any villager could utter a word, he blurted out, everyone, please don't misunderstand. I'm not here to force anyone to pay taxes, I swear it. I was actually trying to help you by advising the magistrate against it. The county magistrate kicked me out of the yamen because I refused to collect them. It's the truth, I swear. Just please, don't hit me. If you have a grievance, take it up with the county magistrates. He was trying to make his innocence and his favors clear. The villagers parted down the middle, forming a path. Yinying stepped forward and stood in the front row, right in front of him. Now, she was the center of attention. The prisoner's gaze naturally fell upon her. He looked completely perplexed. In a normal village, an old, respected chief is usually the one who speaks. But here, they were led by a young woman who tilted her head as if listening to the sky. With a serious face, she asked, who are you, what is your rank, and how much have you seen? The prisoner looked surprised and replied, my surname is Shang, and my name is Air. I was born on October 2nd, hence the name 32. I was the advisor to the magistrate of Chunxian in Shaanxi province. Do you recognize the title? But as of now, I have been dismissed from my post. I studied hard for 10 years and traveled across the entire country. He spoke as if he were a man of great talent and importance. I thought what this guy was saying at first sounded normal enough. But then his voice suddenly rose and his expression became wildly dramatic. He made an affected, exaggerated pause that looked absolutely ridiculous. Watching him through the box, I couldn't help but let out a small laugh. I told Yinying, ask him what year and month it is. Gao Yinying looked a bit surprised. She hurried to relay my divine words. Upon hearing the question, Shang'er looked completely perplexed. He wondered why they were asking for the date, or what the situation was with these villagers. I'd heard that some peasants never leave their village for years and know nothing of the world. Perhaps that was the case here. But despite his confusion, he didn't dare leave the question unanswered. He knew better than to stay silent. Shang'er hesitated for a moment before speaking. With a serious face, he said, it is currently July, in the 7th year of the Tianqi era. His delivery was like a bad parody, so dramatic that no single idiom could describe it. He suddenly clutched his head with both hands. He looked pained, as if no words could possibly resolve his inner turmoil. It was a pathetic sight that made it hard for people to even look at him. The villagers didn't know whether to laugh or cry at his ridiculous display, but I didn't laugh. Instead, I froze, because as someone who spent years on history forums, I knew that date. The 7th year of the Tianqi era belonged to the Ming dynasty. That was the very year the Tianqi Emperor, Zhu Yuxiao, passed away. The Chongzhen Emperor, Zhu Yujian, ascended the throne just as a massive drought ravaged the land. The peasant revolts were about to explode, and the Ming dynasty was entering its final, dying breaths. The dynasty was in its final moments. I told Gao Yining to ask him the current emperor's name. She rushed to ask, but when the question hit him, Shang Er's face turned pale as he stammered. This humble servant dares not speak his majesty's name. I decided right then that he needed a little push to find his courage. Li Daoxian, tapped on the box with a heavy thud. Gao Yining caught the signal and shouted, "This man refuses to name the emperor." She added, "The great immortal is furious. Everyone, grab your weapons." She ordered them to beat the answer out of him, and Gao Chugu was the first to act. He snatched up a thick wooden club, while the other young men tightened their grip. They closed in, brandishing whatever they had in their hands. The rest of the villagers started searching the area for anything they could use. Within seconds, a massive, angry crowd had formed around him. The villagers held up a chaotic mess of improvised weapons. They had clay pots, heavy lids, and even broken table legs. Seeing the mob ready to tear him apart, Shang Er completely lost his nerve. Before the first blow could land, he screamed, "Zhu Yuxiao! It's Zhu Yuxiao! The current emperor's name is Zhu Yuxiao," he wailed. He didn't care about the taboo of speaking the royal name anymore. As the saying goes, the mountains are high and the emperor is far away. Saving his own skin was more important than following some royal taboo. He was so terrified he forgot to use his formal, humble speech. His words came out in a desperate, frantic hiss. I whispered to myself, "Is the emperor really Zhu Yuxiao?" My face darkened as the pieces started falling into place. I signaled Gao Yining to press him for more information. I needed to know exactly what was happening in the world outside this box. Shang Er began reciting details like he was reading from a history book. He spoke of events I had only ever seen in ancient documents. He said that on May 11th, the later Jin armies laid siege to Jinzhou. The imperial court had scrambled to send reinforcements to save the city. But the enemy divided their forces at Yumen on the 28th. The eunuch Lu Jingquan was sent to boost the morale of the trapped soldiers. They boarded the ships in a desperate attempt to turn the tide. They set up camp by the moat and prepared the heavy cannons. Shang Er looked at the villagers surrounding him and froze in confusion. He clearly didn't understand why they were looking at him with such worry. But the villagers didn't lower their weapons for a second. Knowing he was cornered, Shang Er babbled about Mao Wenlong leading an attack. He claimed General Zhu Dasho was already on his way with fresh troops. He rambled on about a massive battle raging just outside the city walls. I whispered a quiet thank you to myself. The man looked like he was about to collapse. He couldn't go on. He didn't even care if his answers satisfied us anymore. In his mind, he was a dead man anyway in this chaotic mess. But for me, he had already said more than enough. Hearing his words, I was now certain about the truth of this village. This wasn't just some random land of tiny people. This was the great Ming dynasty. Specifically, the final, most brutal years of the Ming era. No wonder Gao village was so stripped and desolate. Wasn't this exactly how the common folk suffered at the end of the Ming? Reading about it in history books back in school was one thing. But seeing it like this, it was visceral. Looking at the village inside the box, the sheer desperation felt poisonous. Everything finally clicked into place for me. I decided not to trouble the messenger any further. I told them, he's exhausted and hungry. Give him something to eat. I lost interest in the village's daily chores and turned to my computer. I pulled up a browser and started digging through every historical record of the late Ming I could find. I lost myself in the ocean of history and its final recorded words. Meanwhile, back in the box, Gao Ying relayed my instructions. I watched as the villagers whispered their thanks. They immediately dropped their weapons and prostrated themselves toward the sky. The messenger, Sen Shire, let out a massive sigh of relief. He thought to himself, I actually escaped death. He looked around, thinking these villagers were incredibly strange. They all listened to that young girl as if she were a prophet. To him, she looked like a typical little fraud. Just another liar claiming to speak for a god that wasn't there. He wondered if this was some White Lotus cult or something worse. Falling into the hands of a cult was always a bad omen. He realized he had to play along. If he wanted to stay alive and get home, he had to keep a low profile. He started faking it, imitating the villagers' every move. He bowed toward the sky, having no idea which god he was even praying to. He didn't care about the divinity. He just pressed his face to the dirt. Gao Ying looked at him and said, saving your life isn't shameful. Come with me. She promised to find him food, and since his life depended on it, he didn't hesitate. He hurried after her, nervously asking, Miss, what is this place? I watched him ask, I see your whole village worships a god. Which one is it? He was trying to figure out which faction they supported. Gao Ying just shook her head, having never heard such a question. It was the first time she'd met someone who didn't even know who they were praying to. To her, these villagers had been faithful for 1,000,000 years. She didn't think he was stupid, just lost. She whispered, he is the great god. Do not spread his name lightly. We don't even dare to ask his true name. We only know him as Dewey. His power is limitless, yet he is kind and benevolent to our Gao village. Senshire sneered to himself, thinking these were just myths made up by charlatans. Only gullible fools believe this crap, he thought as they reached her home. They finally arrived at Gao Ying's house. She told him, "Just give me a minute." She pushed open the creaking old wooden door. "Sit down first," she said. "I'm going to the kitchen. I'll prepare something for you to eat." Shire looked up and scanned the room, and his jaw hit the floor. He saw a massive mountain of white rice piled in the corner of the hut. It was truly enormous. Each individual grain was the size of a heavy stone. He stood there, frozen in total shock. A single leaf of Chinese cabbage was leaning against the wall. Well, not even a whole leaf. I could tell by the veins that it was just a small fragment torn from a larger piece. Yet that tiny scrap was as massive as an entire wall. Gao Ying picked up a few broken grains of rice and tore off a piece of that giant leaf. She tossed them into a bamboo basket and headed into the kitchen. It was clear she intended to use these monuments to cook him a simple meal. Shire's mouth hung open in pure, unadulterated shock. He stood there for a long time, unable to process what he was seeing. What kind of rice is this? What kind of vegetable? What is this village? Shire was a typical intellectual of the old world. He was far more educated than the illiterate masses and harder for charlatans to trick. But he couldn't completely escape the superstitions of his era. He didn't believe in the Eternal Mother or the nonsense of the White Lotus sect. He laughed at their claims of a void homeland, but he wasn't an atheist. He still believed there were true gods watching over the world. After a few seconds of silence, he snapped out of it and sprinted toward the kitchen. He shouted at Gao Ying, his voice trembling with urgency. "Which immortal gave you this food?" Gao Ying just looked at him and calmly repeated that she didn't know. Shire stood there, his mind racing as he stared at the giant ingredients. He didn't even bother to ask anything else. Besides, you're supposed to be a man of status. You're a messenger of God, yet you let the villagers walk all over you. You're acting like a complete stranger to your own authority. If we need to build a temple for the gods in the future, nothing will get done at this rate. It's simply absurd. And she was right. It's always better to have someone educated handling things. So Anian lifted her head and shouted toward the sky, great God, what is your holy name?" But the sky remained silent, and I didn't answer because I had already stepped away to read history books. I was focused on the history of the end of the Ming Dynasty, the era when the invaders were finally driven out. The records were filled with such profound sadness. I could barely focus on the little person calling out from inside the box. I couldn't hear her, so Gao Ying just sighed at Shire. "The great God does not wish to speak," she said, as I rubbed my bloodshot eyes and noticed the sun rising. I glanced at the dawn breaking through my window and realized I'd been reading historical documents all night. The history of the late Ming Dynasty and the expulsion of the invaders. I had skimmed through the main events to get the gist of it. I gained a general understanding of the timeline, but the specific details were still a confusing mess. These history books use so much indirect language and contradictions that it's hard to be certain of anything. I double-clicked the mouse to open a file on my desktop. It was the summary I'd spent all night working on, listing my key questions. Question 1. Objects dropped into the landscape box scale up by 200 times in length, width, and height. The volume and weight increase proportionally, though I haven't done the exact math yet. As a humanities student, I just know a 50-gram egg transforms into several tons. Feeding 42 little people is easy. I could even make them live in total luxury. But if I want to feed 1 million people and guarantee their health and safety, that would lead me straight into an embarrassing bankruptcy in the real world. So the real question is, what exactly is my goal here? Do I just protect these 42 people, or do I try to save as many as possible? Should I try to save everyone at the end of the Ming Dynasty? Should I try to save the entire country? If that's the case, my resources are nowhere near enough. I need to reconsider my objectives. Now, question number 2. With the wars at the end of the Ming Dynasty, the lives of these little people are a disaster. They are in constant danger, but I still have to eat, sleep, shower, and maybe even go on a date. I can't watch over this miniature village 24 hours a day. What if I go out to buy groceries and come back to find them all slaughtered? Would it be bandits, or the armies of Li Ziqing and Zhang Xinzhou? To them, this miniature village is just another target in a world gone mad. The village would be nothing but ruins and corpses by the time I returned. That possibility is too high, so I have to improve their ability to protect themselves. Question number 3. This landscape box is only 2.5 meters long and 0.5 meters wide. In their world, that only covers an area 500 meters long and 300 meters wide. It barely covers Gao Village and their fields, making it impossible to influence anything outside. Is there a way to expand this world? I've been thinking about that all night. It's the most urgent problem I need to solve. Of course, question 3 is a matter of mysticism. I'll just have to wait and see. I'll let nature take its course and focus on the first 2 problems for now. I looked up at the sky, pondering my next move. I consider myself a pretty kind-hearted person. I certainly don't intend to save only these 42 little people. That wouldn't be enough for me. If it's possible, I want to save as many of these poor people as I can. I might even try to save the entire country. But I can't just rely on myself to keep dropping food into the box forever. That's not a sustainable strategy, and it would only backfire. It would turn them into lazy, apathetic dependents, and I can't have that. I need to mobilize them to grow their own food and face life with optimism. With that thought in mind, it was time to get to work. The first priority is getting water to these little people so they can stay active. But how exactly do I provide it? Turning on the faucet and aiming it directly at the box is obviously absurd. A stream of water 200 times their size would be a nightmare. If that hits the village, it's not a water supply. It's a flood. I thought about using a sprayer or a humidifier. I did a quick search online to check the specs. Even the finest mist from a humidifier has particles 0.3 millimeters wide, passing through the box, that transforms into a water droplet 6 centimeters wide. If I sprayed that, the density would be unbearable for them. It would be a torrential downpour that would smash their homes to pieces. Their thatched roofs would collapse instantly, so I looked for another way. My gaze fell on a plastic container, and I held it over a patch of wasteland near the village. It fit perfectly, so I reached down and dug a massive hole in the ground. I finished the job in an instant. Morning came, and the villagers were already up and moving. As soon as the sun rose, these hardworking people began preparing for the day. But with the severe drought, the land remained barren and dead. They had no crops to tend to, so they usually spent the morning digging for wild vegetables. However, they still had over 100 cabbages and large leaves stored in their homes. There was no need to rush out and forage for wild vegetables anymore. After waking up, the villagers started on various chores like pressing oil, building bamboo huts, sharpening knives, and mending old clothes. Gao Yuanyuan also planned to patch up her tattered garments. She grabbed her needle and thread, took a small stool, and headed outside. Just as she was about to set the stool down, she heard a faint rustling sound under the morning sun. The noise was coming from the side of the house. She turned the corner and saw Sanair sitting there. I wondered why he was still hanging around the village. Last night, following my instructions, Gao had fed him well. She warned him not to breathe a word about what he saw here. But after seeing those massive grains of rice and giant cabbage leaves, the man was far too shocked to simply walk away. He wanted to stay in the village just a little longer. He had spent the entire night sleeping right under the eaves. He was a pampered advisor, not exactly the type to wake up early. Startled by Gao Yuanyuan, he sat up in a daze. He looked up at her, still blinking the sleep from his eyes. He had been praying ever since I fed him the night before. "Aren't you supposed to be heading back to the county seat?" she asked. He answered her with a dazed, indistinct mumble. He couldn't even explain why he hadn't gone home last night. Suddenly, Gao Yuanyuan's expression shifted as she looked toward the sky. I reached my giant hand down and dug a hole in the clearing near the village. The ground trembled violently as the massive crater appeared. From her perspective, she couldn't see my hand at all. She only saw the earth and stone being ripped away by an invisible force. Sand and dirt were excavated from the pit and piled high to the side. It was an overwhelming sight, like a localized sandstorm. Sanair's mind went completely blank from the shock. He thought he must be dreaming and should have slept longer. He was so stunned he even forgot his favorite 4-character idioms. The commotion alarmed every single person in the village. They all came running toward the open space to see the miracle. Gao Yuanyuan stood up quickly and shouted at the crowd, "Don't get any closer. Don't get in the way of the great sky god's power." The villagers froze in their tracks, watching in awe. They stared at the strange, unfolding scene with wide eyes. Gao Yuanyuan signaled for everyone to stay back and remain calm. She signaled the villagers and then watched the scene intently. She saw the giant hand of the great sky god moving again. My hand descended toward the earth with divine purpose. I dug into the ground until a massive rectangular hole, 45 meters wide and 73 meters deep, appeared. Then, I reached for a transparent box I had prepared. I lowered it slowly from the sky and placed it right into the pit. The box fit perfectly into the freshly dug earth, reinforcing the walls. It was sealed tight on all 4 sides. The villagers couldn't see my hand, but they saw the massive transparent container. They watched it descend slowly from the heavens like a crystal monument. It settled deep into the great pit I had carved out. It was a perfect fit, leaving everyone below absolutely stunned. I clapped my hands together, satisfied that the reservoir was finished. I picked up a glass full of water and began to pour it slowly into the box. The tiny people inside the landscape box witnessed a miracle. A massive waterfall suddenly manifested in the middle of the sky. An enormous torrent of water came crashing down from the clouds. It rushed into the giant container on the ground with a thunderous roar. It didn't take long for the entire box to fill to the brim. In that moment, every person in the village stood frozen, forgetting the world around them. They looked like they had seen a ghost. I watched them standing there, paralyzed, right next to Gao Jia. A giant reservoir now sat in the middle of the village. It was a sight that defied everything they knew. The tank was filled to the top with fresh, modern tap water. To them, receiving this was a divine honor. The water was crystal clear, a treasure for villagers living through a deadly drought. I hadn't seen a look like that on their faces. In many years, water this pure simply didn't exist in their world. "Water, my God," one of them stammered. "How can there be a pool of water this massive?" It was so clean they almost seemed afraid to touch it. "A reward for us. I can't believe it," another whispered. Then the cries broke out. "Long live the great sky god." I leaned over the box, looking down at Gao Jia and the villagers. I told them, "From now on, I will fill this tank every single day." The villagers erupted in cheers, shouting, "We don't have to fear the drought anymore. The cherry seeds, we can finally plant them. What are you waiting for?" Go home and get your buckets, one yelled, before another stopped him. Wait, it's too hot to plant now. We have to wait for autumn, he realized, his joy turning to caution. They were so stunned they almost forgot why they were there. But the women's eyes lit up at the sight of the reservoir. With this much water, they could finally wash their clothes and bathe. They had been filthy and smelling of sweat for over 6 months. No woman could endure that. They scrambled to start hauling water. One man stood there, staring up at the sky in a daze. He looked completely overwhelmed by the miracle before his eyes. It wasn't just a dream he had suddenly woken up from. There was a real, undeniable power manifesting right in front of him. A massive pond had been created out of thin air. A waterfall had poured from the heavens until the basin was overflowing. Who would dare to say this wasn't the work of a god? One woman jumped forward and slapped the man to snap him out of it. Gao Jia leaned in and whispered, Lord Shang, the god wishes to speak with you. Shang Seer snapped to attention and immediately bowed toward the sky. I looked down at him. This man was the county magistrate's advisor. Gao Jia turned his head toward the man expectantly. It was understood that I, the sky god, had been watching the whole time. Shang Seer began to weep, explaining how he had tried to help the people. He had begged the magistrate to stop the taxes, only to face his master's rage. The county magistrate fired him on the spot. That villain doesn't have a job for him anymore. I, Li Daoxian, watched him play with fire and get burned. In other words, he was officially unemployed. Shang Seer prostrated himself and started to ramble, but I cut him off. Listening to him was exhausting, so I spoke with a hint of annoyance. I told him it was no wonder the magistrate kicked him out. I originally thought he'd be a capable advisor who could leak official documents. He could have sent vital news from the county seat to Gaojia village. He would have been of great use to me. Shang Seer trembled, wondering what the god meant by those words. Was the sky god planning to take him in to work for the heavens? Serving a god was a blessing that would last for several lifetimes. He couldn't let this chance slip away, even if it meant dying for the cause. He shouted desperately, this servant is useful. I can be of help. He claimed that even if he was small, he was smart and quick-witted. He knew how to write, calculate, and manage complex records. He asked what the villagers were even doing there compared to him. He insisted it was better for the god to trust a professional. He begged me to leave the tasks to him, promising total loyalty. That's what I call a sales pitch. He was about to summarize his worth into 4 neat points, but he suddenly remembered that I found his rambling annoying. He shut his mouth so fast it was like he slammed on the brakes. The sudden stop made his whole face twitch, and I couldn't help but chuckle. I looked at him and said, fine, but I don't have a specific job for you yet. Go back to the county seat for now and keep your eyes open. Wide open. Keep your ears to the ground and find out everything happening in the area. I needed to know every move the authorities were making. If there's important news, send a messenger to Gaojia village immediately. If I need you for something else, I'll send for you. Shang Seer remained prostrated, his forehead pressed against the dirt. Your servant obeys, he cried, bowing several times before heading back to town. I watched him go and thought about my current limitations. I still haven't found a way to expand my field of vision beyond the village. The landscape box is fixed on Gaojia, leaving me blind to the outside world. But having a guy like Shang Seer out there changes things. It's like having an extra pair of eyes outside the miniature world. I just hope these eyes can play a crucial role when the time comes. I turned my attention back to the village. Every single villager was busy. The strong young men working the fields looked to be in great shape. They finally had the confidence to move forward. They were recovering, even if they had to wait until autumn for a harvest. Their enthusiasm for the work was already uncontrollable. I watched them digging an irrigation canal in advance and nodded. Good. Observation and foresight are vital skills. Their drive for self-sufficiency had been sparked over these last few months. I'd still have to support them for now, but things would get easier by autumn. Once they could farm and feed themselves, the cost of feeding this entire village would start to drop. If I could use this same method to help other villages, I could prevent countless people from starving to death. It was a start. Next, I needed to figure out how to handle the space itself. I had to solve problem number 2, protecting the villagers when I'm not around. I decided it was time to start a proper training campaign. I thought back to the military history forums and historical novels I used to read. The first idea for their defense immediately came to mind. I headed back home to think. I wanted to give each of the 42 villagers a gift, a weapon, but I realized the problem immediately. That specific idea was completely impossible for now. The police would arrest me for trying to buy firearms in modern society. Even if I could get a weapon legally, I hit another wall. Take the smallest gun in the world, the Swiss minigun. It's only 55 millimeters long. If I placed that inside the box, it would scale up 200 times into an 11-meter long monster. Who on earth could hold an 11-meter pistol, let alone fire it? My next thought was to commission someone to make custom miniature weapons. I'd need them to build precise models just a few millimeters long. Once they crossed into the box and grew 200 times, they would become standard 1 to 2 meter weapons for the villagers. But with current technology, that was a pipe dream. Nobody can manufacture a functional pistol only a few millimeters in size. If I wanted to upgrade their combat power, I had to stick to swords. Without better gear, the villagers' potential would stay limited. The only real solution was to teach them how to forge their own muskets. But I had to work with what was already inside the landscape box. The technical skills of these 42 little people were almost non-existent. Expecting them to build factories or manufacture firearms was a fantasy. They struggled to even forge a high-quality blade. Their work was limited to crude wood-cutting tools and basic kitchen knives. I decided to put the weapons aside for now and focus on a different kind of protection. A solid family fortress was the most reliable way to keep them safe. In ancient times, a fortified home could withstand almost any bandit raid. The most iconic version of this was the Hakka walled village. This was something I could actually facilitate from the real world. I could build a structure similar to those fortified houses myself. If I built it at a 1 to 200 scale and placed it in the box, the little people could move in and be safer than ever before. The plan was completely feasible. It would just cost me a bit of money. I needed to head out and find a professional to build me a custom model. A perfect, high-detail scale model. I knew the world inside the box was waiting for its next evolution. Chaos was spreading at the end of the dynasty. I didn't feel comfortable leaving my little people alone in the house. Leaving the box for too long felt like a massive risk. I was terrified of coming home to find their tiny corpses scattered everywhere. Then, a light bulb went off in my head. I grabbed the security camera from my front door. I moved it over and placed it right next to the landscape box. I made sure to set it at the perfect angle. I opened the app on my phone, and the feed came in crystal clear. I could monitor everything inside the box from anywhere. With my mind finally at ease, I hurried out and hailed a taxi. I headed straight to my friend Kai Xingzi's place. 15 minutes later, I arrived. I sat down in his living room. Just me and Xingzi. Kai Xingzi is a professional model maker. Cars, ships, figurines, robots, dinosaurs, you name it. If it's a scale model, he can build it. That's why I originally thought he was the one who sent me the landscape box. When I walked in, Kai Xingzi flashed a wide grin and said, "Dao Xian, it's been too long. I haven't seen you in forever. Are you here to squeeze more free work out of me?" I laughed and told him, "Not this time. I'm paying for a custom commission." Kai Xingzi gave me a skeptical look. "Cut the crap," he said. "You still haven't paid me for that Yaoza model from last time. Every time you show up, I feel like I'm about to get robbed." I didn't hesitate for a second. I pulled out my phone and transferred 1,000 yuan to him instantly. Kai Xingzi's eyes went wide. "Damn, you're paying way too fast. That's a bad sign. Whatever you want must be incredibly difficult. I'm out. I'm rejecting this order right now." I snapped back at him. "You idiot. I give you the money easily and you refuse? But when I don't pay you up front, you don't have any fear at all." Kai Xingzi shrugged. "That's just a businessman's instinct." I held my hands about half a meter apart to show the size. "I want a fortified Hakka-style house about this big, built at a scale of 200 to 1. I knew if I put this model into the landscape box, it would expand 200 times. If the model itself was half a meter tall, it would become a massive fortress for my little people." It was a little white lie. I told him I'd seen an animated movie and fell in love with those Hakka-style fortified houses. "So you want a model to display at home? I get it," Kai Xingzi said. "But why commission a new one? I already have one in stock. It's 100 to 1 scale, and it looks absolutely imposing." I didn't want it, and I cut him off before he could even finish. "I only want the 200 to 1 scale," I insisted. Kai Xingzi looked annoyed. "I have a 144 to 1 model too. You don't want that either?" I told him. "It has to be custom made, down to the last detail. 200 to 1, no exceptions." Kai Xingzi finally started to cave. "I knew this would be complicated," he muttered. "When the money comes this easy, there's always a catch. What other headaches are you bringing me? Besides the scale, what are your specific requirements? I know this is going to be a massive job." I just laughed. He was right to be worried. "All right, let me start listing what I need. The entire Hakka house has to be built with specific, high durability materials. It needs to be incredibly tough. No foam boards allowed. No thin plastic. Even wood is too basic. It breaks too easily. I need something better. What material would work best?" I asked. "I'm no expert. Help me out here." Kai Xingzi laughed and pointed me toward a solution. "Composite materials. They aren't just solid. They're perfect for manufacturing. But they're also incredibly lightweight. You won't break your back lugging the model home." I took a moment to think. Pressed panels might seem thin, but that wasn't the problem. Modern composites are high quality. Once they go inside the box, their thickness and scale, they multiply by 200 times. It's perfect. Ming Dynasty swords and muskets are nothing. They couldn't dream of piercing a plate that's 200 times thicker than normal. Even muzzle-loading cannons wouldn't leave a scratch. I couldn't make it too easy for the enemies in the box. I needed to know the starting point. I asked him curiously, "How thick is the material exactly?" "The thickness of the panel?" I realized it had to be even thinner. "Maybe 3 millimeters?" I did the math in my head. 3 millimeters multiplied by 200. I went silent. Damn, once it's inside the box, that's 60 centimeters thick. That kind of thickness takes up way too much space. If the walls between the rooms are that thick, the number of rooms will drop. I frowned, realizing the layout would be ruined. Kai Xingzi shook his head and told me it couldn't be any thinner unless I used sheet metal. 1 millimeter sheet metal would become a 20 centimeter iron plate inside the box. That's perfect. It won't eat up space like the pressed panels did, and it's even more solid. Fine, let's go with the 1 millimeter sheet metal. Kai Xingzi warned me that a model made of that would look cheap. "It'll look like you're just trying to save money," he said. But I didn't need high-end aesthetics for this. I actually wanted it to look like I was cutting costs, as long as it functioned. The exterior just needs to look decent, but the interior is what matters. It has to be incredibly detailed, with every living space having its own purpose. Everything must be built exactly to scale. It's a massive job. These Haka houses have over 200 rooms. Those tiny doors and windows are what help us see the future. If I have to make every single one functional, so they actually open and close. Do you have any idea how much manual labor that takes? He told me it would cost an extra 10,000. I stared at him for a second. Inside, I thought, damn, that's expensive. Forget the doors and windows then. Just build the main structure. The doors, the windows, the little bridges. The little people inside the box can build those themselves. So, no doors and no windows. Just leave a dark opening wherever the originals would be. Besides, traditional Haka houses have major flaws in their drainage systems. Modify the drainage layout with a more modern solution. I wanted it to be practical, not just a relic. Kai Xingzi almost flipped the table in frustration. Are you stupid or what? He snapped. You want me to take the drainage design into account? If you use a modern solution for the pipes, your model won't be an authentic Haka house anymore. You get that, right? Kai Xingzi looked like he was about to spit blood. He nearly had a stroke right then and there. After rolling his eyes at me, he spoke up, his voice dripping with sarcasm. If you want to add all those extra elements under the house, why not just add some wheels and a motor? Throw in a remote control so the whole Haka house can drive around like a tank. He was just venting, complaining that I was being cheap, using nonsense to mock his own client. But he didn't expect his sarcastic remarks to hit me differently. His words reached my ears and made my eyes light up with a sudden realization. I slapped my thigh hard and shouted, damn, Kai Xingzi, you're a genius. Let's do exactly that. Add the wheels and install a motor. And don't forget the remote control. We'll turn it into a super tank that crushes everything in its path, invincible under the heavens. Wait, don't actually listen to me. Kai Xingzi barked. Is this supposed to be a Haka house model or not? This is just some kid's twisted toy. No, this thing won't have any aesthetic or collector's value at all. I reached out and slapped him right on the shoulder, laughing out loud as I asked, who said I wanted a child's toy? I don't care about aesthetics. And by the way, make the tires extra large so it can handle some light off-roading. Kai Xingzi rolled his eyes, clearly thinking I was a total fraud. He probably felt that since the dawn of time, no client has ever been sane. Adding the tires, the motor, and the remote control cost an extra 1,000 yuan. I paid the fee immediately and confirmed the appointment. I reminded him about the 1-month deadline and headed straight back home. I stopped at the supermarket by the neighborhood entrance and bought a chicken breast. I cut off a small piece and placed it gently in front of Gao Ying and her people. At that moment, Gao Ying was busy filling buckets from the pond, staggering as she tried to carry them back to her house. Suddenly, my giant hand appeared from above, holding a massive slab of meat. I slowly lowered the chicken in front of her and then pulled my hand back. I vanished into the sky, letting my voice echo down to her like a gentle god. I told her to make sure the villagers ate well and stayed strong. They weren't used to having such a feast, but they needed the energy. Eating too much meat all at once could be a shock to their systems. I told them to take it slow and be careful with their stomachs. From a scientific perspective, if a model house is scaled up 200 times, the weight increases geometrically until it's as heavy as a real building. Even if the wheels and the motor were scaled up by the same amount, they theoretically wouldn't be able to move the structure at all. The rubber on the tires would simply collapse under that kind of weight. But once this house is placed inside the landscape box, it becomes more than just a name or a simple object. It becomes a physical part of that miniature world. As long as it stays inside the box, it follows the laws of that reality, not the physics of my own world. That's why the motor and the mechanics will actually function. Inside my landscape box, the impossible becomes possible. Meat, the god has sent us meat, Gao Ying shouted at the top of her lungs. The entire village of Gao sprang into action, everyone gathering around at once. It was just a piece of chicken breast, but to them, it was a mountain of food. They stared at the massive slab, convinced it was a gift from the heavens. In their eyes, only a true god of the skies could provide such a feast. The villagers began to move, their hunger finally replaced by hope. They can't even remember the last time they tasted meat. A few years ago, when the harvests were good, some villagers still raised chickens. But with the drought worsening year after year, the people barely have enough scraps to keep themselves alive. Finding food for livestock became an impossible luxury. Now, in the village of Gao, there isn't a single dog or chicken left, only a crowd of starving people. They were all shouting in disbelief. In a place where nothing lives, seeing a sign of life is a miracle. Seeing this massive slab of meat had everyone's hearts racing with excitement. Gao Chubu immediately grabbed a knife and rushed forward. He prepared to carve the first few portions of the feast. But let's get back to the matter at hand, the house and the task I have for you. If this connection is severed, it's over. I watched them closely. Gao Ying is certain of one thing. She knows they have to be careful. If they let their hunger take over, their weak stomachs will fail them. Thank you, Divine Lord, they whispered in unison. I heard their gratitude echoing from the box. But I had to make sure they didn't overdo it. If I gave Gao Chubu too much at once, he wouldn't be able to help himself. He would devour the entire thing in one sitting. The village chief stepped in and ordered everyone to take only a tiny portion, just a single ounce of meat for each person. The children gathered the rest, cutting it into strips to dry in the wind. They were desperate to keep it from rotting, but a middle-aged villager grew worried. He stepped forward and said, "Chief, we don't have enough salt. If this chicken doesn't cure properly in the wind, it's going to spoil. Instead of letting it rot, we should just eat it all now," he argued with a nervous laugh. "Even if I stuff myself until I die, I refuse to sit here and watch meat. This could go to waste." Chubu swallowed hard and added, "I'd rather die of a burst stomach than waste a bite." I listened to their desperate logic from outside the box. I didn't take the extra meat back to my refrigerator. Instead, I went to my kitchen and grabbed a bag of salt. I began pouring it right in front of Gaoing. A small mountain of white crystals piled up as the villagers looked on in awe. I watched as the salt appeared out of nowhere inside the landscape box. It was refined salt, a pure and blinding white. It slid and tumbled to the ground like massive blocks of ice. In no time at all, it formed a small mountain before them. Gaoing stared up at me in disbelief. I didn't need to hear her say it. She was just being greedy, and I was being generous. Did they really think their almighty God wouldn't know they were trying to feast all at once? "Now you have salt," I thought. "Go make your cured meat." "So much salt," the villagers whispered. "Salt is so expensive. You give us so much. My God, it's been forever since we could afford to buy any." The villagers fell to their knees again, prostrating themselves on the dirt road. They bowed desperately toward the sky, thanking me for the miracle. Finally, the Gao family and the rest of the villagers had work to do. The men grabbed their knives and began hacking at the massive chicken breast. They sliced it into thin strips and ground the giant salt crystals into a fine powder. Once the salt was ready, they took the strips of chicken meat. They rolled each piece in the salt powder until they were completely coated. A thick, white layer covered the meat before they hung it up to dry. The wind began to pick up, slowly drawing the moisture out of the chicken strips. Watching them work, I realized this task was actually quite exhausting for them. As the villagers worked, their faces were covered in smiles. That night, smoke rose from every chimney in the village. Every single family was cooking. In every pot across the village, chicken porridge was simmering. They chopped a few pieces of chicken into tiny bits and boiled them with white rice. They let it cook until the texture was thick and sticky. They even added fresh cabbage leaves to the mix. The resulting porridge looked delicious and easy on the stomach. Gao Chubu managed to scarf down 5 large bowls in a row. Even little Gao Ying, that poor mistreated girl, finished 2 whole bowls. Watching them eat, I felt my own mouth start to water. I quickly grabbed my phone and ordered a bowl of chicken broth rice for myself. I needed to satisfy my own hunger to stay calm. As I ate my meal, I checked my bank balance online. I had a little over 20,000 yuan left in my savings. That amount didn't feel like nearly enough. Just ordering supplies for their tiny houses had cost me 2,000 yuan today. If I wanted to help more people in that box, my money would vanish like water. I thought about it for a few seconds, then opened up my messaging app. I found an old contact and sent a message. "Brother, it's Li Daoxian. Remember 6 months ago? I asked if that offer for extra freelance work was still on the table. I had turned it down before, back when I was young and stubborn. But things were different now." I told him, "If you have any design gigs, I'm ready to take them." The price was negotiable, and his avatar started flashing instantly. "I've been waiting for you to say that," he replied. "I have a job right now." It was character design work for a specific client. A gaming company needed them finished immediately. The deadline was tight, only 5 days. For character designs for 3,000 yuan. "Do you want it?" he asked. I didn't hesitate. "I'll take it." The sun began to rise on a brand new day. I stood up and gave my body a long, deep stretch. I rubbed my temples, feeling the weight of the last 5 days. I had been working myself to the bone until 2 in the morning every night. I was pushing my limits just to finish everything on time. Finally, the character designs were complete. I sent them off to the gaming company and waited. After the client reviewed them, they pointed out a few tiny flaws. I modified them exactly as they asked, only for them to decide the first version was better. I sent a quick thank you. Just like that, the job was done and 3,000 yuan was credited to me. I confirmed the money was in my account before I let myself relax. I drifted off to sleep instantly, finally at peace. It was a deep, heavy sleep that lasted until the next dawn. For the last 5 days, I'd been so busy grinding for cash that I had completely neglected my other family. I was talking about the tiny people inside the box. I had only been giving them food at set intervals and at night. I'd just pour water into the lock and lock box without really watching them. Now that I was finally free of my financial worries, I decided today was the day to take proper care of my little pets. But the moment I sat down by the observation box, I felt something was off. The tiny villagers were all gathered together. They were huddling at the edge of the pond, whispering urgently. I quickly shut the window to kill any outside noise. I pressed my ear right against the box, straining to hear exactly what they were saying. Was someone actually stealing from them? How could they be losing water? I checked the water level to get a better read on the situation. The water in the pond had dropped significantly. This lock and lock box was losing volume fast. In my world, the box is only 20 centimeters long. But down there, in the world of the tiny beings, everything is scaled up 200 times larger. That small container is actually a massive 4-meter-long reservoir to them. And the water level had dropped 15 centimeters in a single night. Either this water thief is incredibly powerful, or there's a whole army of them. I followed the messy, wet footprints. as they trailed all the way to the outskirts of the village. What if the control system is shifting? The tracks reached the very edge of the landscape box and simply vanished. I frowned, realizing the biggest flaw of this box. My perspective is way too narrow. I can only see this tiny section of the village. The rest of Gao Village is hidden from me. The world outside these walls is a complete mystery. I have absolutely no idea what's happening out there. I have to find a way to expand my field of vision. I'm trapped looking at this one tiny box. After being annoyed by the narrow view for a few seconds, I suddenly remembered something. I had installed a surveillance camera near the observation box 5 days ago. It was supposed to monitor everything that happened inside the landscape. The footage from last night should be right there, so I quickly opened the app on my phone. I pulled up the recording list and scrolled through the logs. I went to bed after 2 a.m., so I just needed to check the footage from that time on. It didn't take long to uncover the truth about the midnight water theft. I saw a large group of ragged people who looked just like the villagers. They were ordinary tiny humans from Gao Village. Carrying buckets under the moonlight, they made their move. They cautiously approached the large reservoir in the neighborhood, right there in the middle of Gao Village. They dipped their buckets into the pond, filled them up, and hauled them away. About an hour later, the same group returned to the site. They filled 2 more buckets each and fled into the darkness. They made 3 trips like that, taking 3 hours until dawn, and then they vanished. The pond's water level had dropped by half a foot. Watching the footage, I didn't even know what to say. I put my phone away and listened to the villagers' heated argument. I don't know which thieves dared to steal our water, but this is too much. The great God gave us this precious spring. We can't let others just take it. Where is the village chief? He needs to come here right now. Tell us what to do. We should track them down and catch those water thieves. We need to give them a lesson they'll never forget. A total beating. We have to get our water back. If we don't, the great God will blame us for failing to protect his gift. They were terrified of losing my favor, so I decided to intervene. I spoke up, my voice booming. Gao Jia, tell everyone something for me. Tell them not to pursue the people who took the water. Gao Jia had been standing among the villagers just a moment ago. She was full of indignation, wondering who would dare steal from the god. Suddenly, she heard my voice resonating from the very heavens. She froze in shock and lifted her head to peer through the clouds. Up there, the mist parted to reveal a divine presence. The massive, handsome face of the great god was looking down at her. She spoke up quickly, her voice trembling with reverence. Great God, someone has stolen your precious gift. She feared my wrath, thinking I'd be furious enough to strike them all down. Every villager in the area turned their heads toward her. They saw her speaking to the empty sky and realized she was talking to me. They all covered their mouths, not daring to make a single sound. I told them the truth. Those thieves were just desperate people from another village. They have no water to drink and are on the brink of death. The small amount they took is nothing to me. I can refill the pond in a second. There's no point in hunting down people who are already dying of thirst. Gao Jia rushed to relay my words to the entire village. The crowd's fierce, vengeful energy vanished instantly. They all dropped to their knees, prostrating themselves toward the heavens. The great sky god is merciful. His grace is our salvation. They chanted a mess of prayers and blessings that echoed up toward me. I felt a deep sense of relief, but I knew 42 followers wasn't enough. I need to save more of these little people, starting with those water thieves. I just hope my bank account can handle the cost of being a god. That night, as the villagers went to sleep, the landscape box fell silent. But I stayed awake, researching the Ming dynasty while keeping an eye on my tiny world. The group of water thieves from last night had returned under the cover of darkness. It was late, already 3 in the morning. Outside my window, the city was still wide awake. Modern nightlife is vibrant, with cars still racing down the highway. People in the streets were busy grilling food and drinking beer, their laughter echoing. I felt a sudden pang of hunger, so I grabbed my phone to order some food. I settled on some skewers for a late-night delivery to my apartment. As I waited in the silence of the night, a tiny figure dressed in rags emerged within the box. He was creeping along the northern edge of the landscape. He stared toward Gao Village for a long moment, then signaled behind him, and more figures appeared. A large group of little people followed his lead. Each one carried a water bucket, their backs hunched as they moved on tiptoe. They began their slow, desperate march toward the village. I stood up and walked over to the window. I shut it tight, letting the glass block out the city lights. The outside noise faded, leaving my room in absolute silence. I leaned in close and pressed my ear against the edge of the landscape box. Inside that tiny world, a heavy silence reigned. The little people moved without making a single sound with their footsteps. They soon reached the edge of the village pond inside the landscape box. Their leader leaned over and took a long look at the water. He let out a sharp, involuntary gasp of pure shock. One of the men behind him hadn't noticed the change yet. He whispered, "Brother Wang, what's wrong? Why did we stop?" The leader, Wang, pointed a trembling finger at the pond in front of them. He spoke in a daze. "Last night, we clearly drained a massive amount of water. And these people can't survive without it. They have to drink. The people of Gao Village should have used up even more by now. The water level should be even lower than when we left it, right? But look, the pond is completely full again." I watched them from above, my name being Li Daoxian. I chuckled to myself, knowing I had just poured in a fresh cup of water. The little thieves gathered around the edge of the pond, whispering in hushed tones. They were all utterly baffled, staring at the high water line in disbelief. The pond was brimming, reflecting the dim light of my room. They looked up at the sky, knowing it hadn't rained a single drop all day. How could the water level rise on its own? It was impossible. Brother Wong stood there completely stunned, trying to maintain his composure as the boss. Wong couldn't just stand there in a daze, so he waved his hand and hissed a quiet order. Stop worrying about the water and start filling your buckets immediately. Stop the chatter. If you wake up the people of Gao Village, and they catch us red-handed, we'll all be dead men. At his command, the group of men rushed forward. They scrambled to the edge of the pond, plunging their wooden buckets into the cool, clear water. Some were so desperate they shoved their entire heads into the water to drink greedily. Watching this through the landscape box, I felt a pang of pity. They looked like nothing more than starving refugees. My eyes drifted to my bag of rice. I reached out, wanting to grab a handful for them. I was about to drop it in, but then I stopped to think for a second. Once a single grain of my rice hits their world, it scales up to a massive 40 to 60 centimeters long. Their tiny wooden buckets wouldn't even be able to hold a single grain. I couldn't just let them roll the rice home across the dirt. That's what the Gao villagers have to do just to move a single meal around. Making them roll giant rice for 15 kilometers back to their village seemed cruel. Giving them something that big would be more of a burden than a blessing. I looked at them and realized I needed a better plan. Giving them giant rice in the middle of the night would be a disaster. The sheer weight of it could actually kill someone. I needed to give them something else. Something practical that they could actually carry, like small granules of food. I had to move carefully, making sure I didn't scare them half to death. I didn't want to overwhelm them. If I did this right, they wouldn't just see a miracle, they'd see a meal. Thanks for watching the video. I reached for a small pinch of something from my kitchen. I grabbed some flour while the little men continued their frantic work. They were still scooping water as softly and quietly as they could. I carefully dropped a tiny pinch of flour right behind them. To them, it must have looked like a massive white tower forming. A literal hill of flour appeared as Brother Wong stepped forward. He was the first to finish filling his buckets using his carrying pole. He hoisted the heavy buckets onto his shoulders, turning slowly to make sure he didn't spill a single drop. I watched him try not to shake, terrified he'd spill a single drop of that precious water. In a drought like this, losing even a splash would haunt a man for a long time. But as soon as he turned around and saw the landscape behind him, he froze, completely stunned by what had appeared out of nowhere. Right behind him, a strange white substance had manifested, forming a small, snowy hill that left Brother Wong's mouth hanging wide open. The bucket slipped from his shoulders and hit the ground with a heavy crash, wasting every last drop. The villagers nearby gasped in pure agony at the sight of the wasted water. They shouted, "Brother Wong, why would you drop the buckets?" One man looked so heartbroken, he looked ready to kneel and scoop the mud into his mouth. Brother Wong's voice was stiff as he pointed. "Everyone, look behind you." The villagers at the edge of the pond turned around one by one. As each person turned, they were instantly paralyzed by the sight. In the blink of an eye, the entire group looked like they'd been struck by a paralysis spell. They stood there, rigid and upright, staring stupidly at the white mound I had placed. To them, it was a massive, mysterious hill of pure white powder. One villager opened his mouth to scream in terror, but Brother Wong lunged forward. He clamped his hand over the man's mouth just as the others started to snap out of it. "Quiet, we're in Gao Village stealing water. Don't you dare make a sound. If they got caught, they'd be disgraced on the spot." Brother Wong approached the small, white hill and picked up a single grain. He sniffed it and muttered, "Is this flour? No, I can't be wrong." The grains were large, as if the powder had absorbed moisture. It looked like flour that had started to clump together. Another villager stepped forward, looking just as confused. I watched them, wondering if they could even process what they were seeing. The man asked himself how the scent of flour had suddenly filled the air. "Am I just so hungry that I'm starting to hallucinate?" he whispered. He looked toward Brother Wong for an answer. None of them had seen where this massive mound of food came from. Brother Wong grit his teeth and said, "The Gao villagers must have placed this here. They must have snuck up behind us while we were distracted by the water." The other villagers exchanged perplexed looks, wondering why anyone would be so kind. Why would they give away so much flour for free in the middle of the night? Brother Wong scanned the area, looking left, right, and behind every tree. He couldn't see a single soul in the darkness. He tossed a clump of the flour into his mouth and started chewing. He nearly choked on the dry powder, but his eyes lit up with realization. "It's real," he whispered. "The Gao villagers really gave this to us. They knew we came to steal water in the middle of the night. To save our dignity, they didn't confront us, but instead left this flour out of pity." The other villagers couldn't wrap their heads around that logic. Brother Wong ignored their confusion and ordered them to empty their water buckets into the pond. He told them to use the buckets to carry as much flour as they possibly could. He warned them that if anyone spilled a single grain, they were dead. "I'll beat you to death myself," he growled at the group. The villagers didn't know whether to laugh or cry at his intensity. "You don't even have to say it, Brother Wong," one replied. "If we waste this flour, we'll kill ourselves before you even get the chance." They didn't need any more motivation than the sight of the food. They dumped the water back into the pond, but they were afraid to use the wet buckets. They knew the flour would stick to the damp wood and go to waste. So they took those wet buckets and began to work frantically. They blew on the wood and swung the buckets through the air to dry them. Once the buckets were dry enough, they rushed toward the white mound. They filled every container to the brim, standing frozen in place once they were loaded. They began to walk with extreme caution, tiptoeing across the dirt. They were more careful now than they were on the nights their wives gave birth. It was as if they were cradling their own newborn children in their arms. They held those buckets like a newborn child in their arms, terrified that one false step would send the flour rolling into the dirt. Losing even a grain would hurt them so much they wouldn't be able to breathe. The group reached the outskirts of the village with Brother Wang leading the way. Suddenly, he set his bucket down and pressed his hands together toward Gao village. It was a gesture of the highest respect. I watched as he vowed that Wang Dihai would never forget this favor. He swore he would return it one day, no matter what. He didn't know exactly who he was thanking, but he knew it was someone important. Someone at the top of the hierarchy in Gao village. Right now, he was nothing more than a common water thief. He assumed this important person didn't want to be seen meeting someone like him. But he promised himself that next time, he would come openly to give his thanks. Hearing his words, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. I realized his name was Wang Dihai. That name, I felt like I had seen it somewhere before. My heart raced as I quickly pulled up the historical documents I'd been studying. I scanned the pages, searching for any mention of his family name. Finally, I found it in a book titled A History of Lu Xiao. It recorded a great drought that turned thousands of miles of land into a wasteland. They defied every danger just to survive. The records even vividly described their desperate hunt for small yellow stones. It was the year of the metal rabbit in the Tia era. A sudden, brutal drought struck the land. The suffering in Cheng City was unbearable to read, but a man named Wang Gear rose up. He gathered hundreds of men in the mountains, all wearing linen masks. Wang Gear and the others made a blood oath, asking, "Who dares to kill Magistrate Shang?" The crowd roared back in unison, "I dare to kill him." After chanting this 3 times, they stormed the city gates. The guards didn't even dare to face them as the mob swarmed the magistrate's office. Historians defined this uprising led by Wang Gear as the official starting point of the Great Peasant Revolts. He was the spark that eventually toppled the Great Ming Dynasty. Legends like Li Ziqing and Zhang Xinzhong were nothing more than his successors. I silently closed my browser and turned my attention back to the landscape box. Wang Dihai had already led his men out of the miniature world. All that remained were scattered footprints and a few specks of spilled flour. They even left traces where the light of my world had touched them. The dust of their struggle settled back onto the tiny earth. I took a deep breath and let out a long, heavy sigh. It makes sense, since you are the very symbol of life. This was the dawn of the peasant wars at the end of the Ming Dynasty. So it seems that, in just a short time, the flames of the peasant revolt will reach Gao village. "We'll meet again," I whispered, turning away. I looked down at the ruined houses. I realized that once the rebellion fully ignited, Gao village would inevitably be dragged into the war unless I intervened. I could stay in front of the landscape box, sweeping armies away with my hand. I could personally guarantee the safety of my tiny people, but they are so small, and if I were to fall asleep or step out for a moment, they would be in grave danger. The fortified manor won't be ready for a month, but Wang Dihai's uprising is imminent. I can't just sit here and wait for the construction to finish. I need to find something else to protect them right now. I scanned my room, searching for anything that could help the little ones. And then, I saw it. It hit me instantly. Leaning against the bookshelf was a discarded piece of rusted sheet metal. My eyes lit up with a new plan. Scrap metal. I can use this to forge armor for the little ones. But these villagers have almost no combat experience. Even if I deck them out in full plate armor, they won't necessarily be able to defeat bandits and government soldiers. I need to give them something more reliable. My gaze shifted back to a pile of Lego bricks near my desk. This could serve as a temporary stronghold until the manor is finished. The sun began to rise, and Gao Jiji woke up. In the past, every morning followed the same desperate routine. She didn't even have to think. She would just grab her bamboo basket. She'd head out to scavenge for wild herbs, tree bark, and roots. She would work herself to exhaustion from dawn until dusk. But now, with the food I've provided, she actually has time to plan her day. The village has plenty of water now, so she starts by washing her face. She was born a beautiful child, but she used to be so dirty and malnourished. Her thin, sallow face used to hide her looks, but a few days of full meals changed everything. Eating meat for several days straight has transformed her. Her energy and her spirit are much more vibrant now. As she washes her face, I can see her cheeks have become round and full. With color back in her skin, she looks like a completely different person. She looks nothing like her old self, and she's only going to get prettier. The only problem now is that her clothes are old and worn out, even if they are freshly washed. I'll have to fix that later. After washing up, she stood there, unsure of what to do. She slowly opened the door and stepped outside, but she hadn't even taken 2 steps when my massive hand reached through the clouds and descended toward the earth. Gao Yi knew immediately that her god was about to provide for them again. What would I be giving the village today? The villagers gathered around, eager to see what would sustain them next. Would it be noodles, vegetables, or more meat? None of the above. What I lowered down to them was a massive, looming block of iron. I had stripped away the rusted outer layer of the scrap metal, cleaned off the wood debris, and salvaged a clean sheet of recycled iron. In my world, it was only 10 centimeters long, 5 centimeters wide, and a mere 0.3 millimeters thick. But this tiny scrap of metal, when placed in front of Gao Yi, transformed into a slab 20 meters long, 10 meters wide, and 6 cun thick. To them, it was a giant iron monument 6 centimeters deep. Gao Yi stood there, completely stunned. I thought to myself, are we supposed to eat iron plates today? I couldn't help but chuckle at the thought. I teased her, is food the only thing on your mind? This iron is for making armor. Gao Yi looked at it with curiosity, repeating, iron armor? I told her to gather the villagers and study the metal, remembering they had a blacksmith. I tried to recall his name, and Gao Yi quickly answered for me. Right, his name was Gao Ji. Under his expert guidance, I wanted the villagers to equip every young man in the village. They needed custom-made iron armor, so Gao Yi summoned her courage and ran toward the crowd. She called out to everyone. A short while later, the entire village had gathered around. They all stared down at the massive iron slab on the ground. Gao Chaofu was the first one to speak up. Great God, does he want us to eat this? He grinned, showing off a row of slightly yellowed teeth. I don't think I can bite through this, he joked, echoing my earlier thought. He was practically imitating my own tone. Gao Yi laughed and scolded him. You only think about eating. The great God gave us this plate for. The great God wants us to make armor. Gao Shugu got it? A middle-aged man pushed his way through the crowd. It was Gao Ji, the village blacksmith. He usually makes kitchen knives for the villagers, but iron armor? That's complicated, and he had never made a single piece before. He walked around the massive iron plate twice, gesturing wildly. A piece of iron this size must be worth a fortune, but it needs to be melted. We need to transform it, but the slab is just too big. I don't have a furnace large enough to melt something like this. I reached my hands down into the soil of the landscape box. To me, this 3,000-meter-high sheet of metal was different. It felt like soft dough in my hands, ready to be kneaded. I could shape it to my will. I gripped the left and right sides and snapped it with a loud pop. The sheet broke, and I kept tearing it into dozens of small pieces. The villagers watched as an invisible hand twisted the iron in the air. The metal deformed and snapped again with another sharp pop. I twisted and broke the pieces further, preparing the base materials. The massive plate that loomed over them just moments ago was now nothing more than scrap metal in my eyes. I tore the metal into dozens of jagged fragments. To them, it was a massive 6-centimeter thick iron plate. But right before their eyes, it was being twisted and snapped like paper. The sight was absolutely shocking. A display of raw, divine power. The villagers immediately began to scramble. As they started to kneel again, Gao Yi quickly wrote down my command. The great God says don't waste time kneeling. Get up and get to work. They cried out in realization and rushed through the village streets. To work. Everyone, to work. Move these iron blocks back to the village. Stack them by the furnace so we can start melting them down. We're going to need way more firewood and charcoal for this. But one question lingered. Why did the great God suddenly want iron armor? I watched as the villagers strained to move the heavy iron blocks. I listened in as they whispered among themselves while they worked. They argued about the transport, the quality of the metal, and what it was for. But not a single person mentioned that hoarding armor was considered an act of rebellion. These people were completely cut off from the outside world and its laws. I told Gao Yi to tell them, make this armor to protect yourselves from the next bandit raid. Gao Yi nodded, his eyes burning with a resolve I'd never seen. He would never forget the tragedy of his mother's death. Thinking of her falling under a bandit's blade, his face darkened with grief. I knew the coming days would only get more dangerous for this village. Food alone wouldn't save them. They needed to become the predators. Gao Yi repeated my words to the crowd, and the village chief was the first to react. The great God is warning us. The bandits will return to invade our home. A wave of panic rippled through the women of the village. What can we do? They cried, but the men already understood the mission. The great God gave us the answer. Every young man and woman will have iron armor. We have the bandits' stolen knives, and soon, we'll have the protection to match. We are eating well and growing strong. Why should we fear those bastards anymore? The realization hit them, and suddenly, everyone had a purpose. The able-bodied rushed out to haul the iron fragments back to Gao Yi's house. Others brought their homemade charcoal and piled it high in the yard. Inside Gao Yi's humble workshop, the small furnace began to glow a fierce, angry red. Young men helped heave the massive iron blocks into the heat to melt them down. They watched Gao Yi as he raised his hammer and struck the metal with a deafening clang. They asked him how to forge the plates, but he admitted he didn't know the complex methods. I don't need fancy techniques, he shouted. I just need to make us invincible. I know how to make Liandong armor. It's just a simple iron plate. One plate in the front, one plate in the back, tied together. Just 2 slabs of iron held in place with a sturdy rope. When you wear it, it can block any blade coming at your chest or spine. Total protection for your front and your back. That is what we call Liandong armor. But one villager frowned and asked, why not forge a full iron cylinder? If we just slide a solid iron tube over our bodies, we'd be safe. Gowie scoffed. And how would you swing a knife if you can't move your arms? I watched from above as the group argued back and forth near the furnace. Listening to their debate, I couldn't help but knit my brows in frustration. Their technical knowledge was practically non-existent. Their understanding of metallurgy was so low that even with the best materials, they couldn't craft a decent suit of armor, so I had to find a way to upgrade them. But wait, teaching them advanced smithing would take months, maybe years. I couldn't put out a nearby fire with water that was miles away. I needed a shortcut, like finding a way to lure skilled talent to the village. I needed to bring in competent professionals from outside these walls. As I turned that thought over in my mind, a specific memory suddenly flashed through my head. I remembered that secretary who always spoke with such affectation. That person might actually be useful right now. Gao Jia, I shouted down from the heavens. Gao Jia immediately looked up with deep respect, searching the sky. She had delicate features and slightly flushed cheeks, a truly beautiful woman. But she was barely a centimeter tall, so I put those thoughts aside. I told her to send Gao Shu to the county seat to find number 32. I needed him to recruit some skilled artisans to come to the village. Gao Jia responded quickly and called for Gao Shu. After receiving his instructions, Gao Shu gathered his team. The 3 young men who went last time packed their rations and set off. With them gone, I turned my attention back to my Lego blocks. I planned to use these to build a temporary wall for Gaojia village. It didn't need to be complex. I just had to snap them together. I connected the blocks one by one into a long, sturdy horizontal strip. I carefully lowered this long strip into the display box. I began to wrap it around the entire perimeter of the village. Down below, the villagers were still going about their business. They were busy inspecting the area, unaware of what was coming. Suddenly, the sound of wind and thunder roared as the very earth began to shake. They looked up and saw massive, strange objects hanging in the air. These colorful shapes fell from the sky like ash, landing a moment later. They slammed down all around the village. The construction happened in the blink of an eye. The blocks encircled all of Gaojia village, forming a gargantuan wall. Only a single gate remained open in a wall twice the height of a donkey. The thickness was terrifying, though the material looked a bit strange. It wasn't as hard as stone. It felt like you could score the surface with a knife. What's happening? Gaojia village looks like a fortified city now. The villagers crowded around, whispering about the rainbow-colored barrier. Gaoi followed the steps up to the top of the wall and stood there, breathless. He looked down at the new city gate. He immediately organized the village and sent men out. He ordered them to stand guard at the entrance. They began setting up a rotation for the watch. If the bandits attack, we take our weapons to the field and go to war. We have our iron armor to protect us. The villagers stood tall, their fear replaced by a newfound resolve. They were ready to follow the instructions of their great sky god. I watched in silence as the villagers quickly assigned their roles. They gathered the manpower to fell trees and craft gates for their new city. Their craftsmanship was rough, hacking down trunks the thickness of an arm. They stripped the branches and lashed the logs together with straw ropes. The village chief kept everyone organized and moving with purpose. The villagers established a strict order for the watch. 2 men stood at the gate, clutching the bows and arrows they'd stripped from the bandits. They took their posts like true sentinels, and I had to admit, it was impressive. Gaojia village finally had a basic level of self-defense. As long as these people didn't do anything reckless, they could spot the bandits coming, block the gate, and hold the line. The bandits wouldn't set foot in the village as long as they held out until I arrived. If they could do that, everything would be fine. Now, I just hoped Gao Chugu could find what he needed in the county seat. At that moment, Gao Chugu stood outside the gates of the county yamen. He had changed into a long, clean robe to look presentable. He wanted to look like someone worth listening to. He approached the guards who were stationed at the entrance. He stopped right before the heavy doors. "Excuse me, I have something I need to ask," he said politely. "Has there been any news of a major event happening recently? Back when I was a scribe here, I treated you well. Giving me a little information isn't asking too much, is it?" The guard thought it over, remembering the scribe's habit of using such a formal tone. "Fine," the guard whispered. "I'll tell you this. The magistrate sent out several teams the day before yesterday. They visited several villages for the harvest, but Master Sans opposed the collection. The magistrate kicked him out right then and there. I remembered it clearly. The yamen had sent groups to Gao village, Wang village, and others. But they didn't bring back a single grain of rice from Gao village," the guard added. I smiled to myself, thinking of the situation back at the village. With a great god watching over them, how could they expect to take anything? I suspected the tax officials who went there probably got a rough reception before being chased off. The group that went to Sheng village brought back some taxes, but it wasn't enough. The biggest haul was supposed to come from Wang village. The soldiers beat that gang of scoundrels from Wang village and even set fire to an abandoned, ruined house to show they meant business. By that afternoon, the people of Wang village were trembling. They were paralyzed with fear. Finally, taking advantage of the darkness, the soldiers broke into their homes. They stole every last bit of their grain and even their seeds for planting. They brought it all back like war booty. Hearing this, I jumped in shock and blurted out, "The grain for the fields? You actually stole the people's seed grain? Good God, you can't touch that. Haven't you heard the saying? A man lets his parents starve before he eats the seeds for next year's harvest. The guard just stared back with a cold, indifferent expression. If the taxes aren't collected, the magistrate is the one who suffers, he shrugged. And if he suffers, we all suffer. I felt a surge of alarm. Wong Village was going to revolt over this. The guard just sneered. That pack of scoundrels? They wouldn't dare. I didn't waste another second at the yamen and rushed straight home. The moment I burst through the door, I shouted to my wife, kids, and servants. Pack your bags. We're leaving the county capital right now. We had to hide. It was time to get out while we still could. My wife, a sturdy woman, looked at me with pure terror and asked why. Just move, I barked. 3 years of drought. The people are starving. And now the magistrate is sending men to steal their very survival. This is going to end in a bloodbath, and we need to be long gone. If we stay, we'll end up sharing the same fate as the magistrate. This wasn't cowardice. It was survival. There was no time to lose. I told them to pack their things and flee immediately. My third wife heard my words, but she didn't feel the danger yet. She thought a few rebelling villagers were nothing to fear. In her mind, they would just become bandits and avoid the city. I lowered my voice and leaned in close. You don't understand, I hissed. Wong Village isn't some ordinary place. There is a man there from the northern border. Wong here is back visiting relatives, and he's a legend in these parts. He fights with a bamboo staff, and his skill is terrifying. A dozen men can't even get near him. His reputation is massive. If a man like that raises his arm in rebellion, God help us all. This entire county and every town for miles will be in deep trouble. I wasn't going to wait around for the fallout. A wise man doesn't stand under a crumbling wall. I'm done with the yamen. It's time to disappear. Meanwhile, behind the mountain at Wong Village, Wong here stood with a grim face. He looked at the desperate villagers gathered before him. Last night, he had organized a group to steal water from Gao Village, but the mission had taken an unexpected turn. Every single man had returned carrying 2 buckets of flour instead. It was delusional. The whole group of them were in high spirits, walking with a swagger I hadn't expected. But as soon as they stepped back into the village, that good mood vanished. The government officials had actually used their absence as an opening. They raided Wangya village in the dead of night, wounding villagers and setting fires. They burned a ruined hut to the ground and stole every scrap of the villagers' harvest. Several men with head wounds and blood-soaked bandages threw themselves at Wong Here's feet, weeping in agony. Brother Wong, you have to do something. My crops were all I had. They stole everything, even though the drought is finally over. Even if God sends us rain now, I have nothing left to plant. My entire family is going to starve. My life's work is gone. I'm going to die anyway. Wong Here's rage suddenly boiled over. Clench your fists, brothers. I have brought back flour. Make dumplings, eat until you're full, and then we rise up against those bastards. The crowd gasped. Rebellion? That was a crime. Punishable by the most brutal means. It meant beheading. Beheading? Your families don't even have fields anymore. What are you afraid of? Instead of starving, let's go cut off Magistrate Shang Yao's dog head. Before we die, everyone stopped to think long and hard. It was the truth. Wong here reached down and grabbed a handful of black soot from the scorched earth. He smeared it across his face, stood tall, and raised his fist. He roared at the top of his lungs. Who dares to kill Shang Yao? The villagers blackened their own faces and answered as one. I dare. Good, then let's move. We rebel, eat the dumplings, and once we're full, we march on the county seat to take that dog's head. I watched as he looked at the men surrounding him. There were about 100 villagers, a small number for a rebellion. He called over 2 young men and gave his orders. Go to Zhangjiasi and Xingxiao villages and find my 2 brothers. Tell them clearly, Wong here of Wangyao village is rising up right now. Ask them if they have the guts to join me. The 2 messengers took off immediately toward the neighboring villages. They disappeared into the night toward Xingxiao and Sun. Meanwhile, Gao Chujue entered the fray. He arrived at the county seat with 3 young men in tow. This was their second time coming to the city, and they were bold. Far braver than they had been the first time. The first time, they were fearful and hesitant. But now, they were naturally calm and composed. I suppose that's the difference between having seen the world and being blind to it. The 4 men didn't stay hidden. They were quite talkative. They began asking the locals for the street where the residence was located. Master Qian's estate. Soon enough, someone pointed the way. The 4 men navigated through the streets and alleys until they reached the gate. They stood right before the Qian household. Gao Chujue raised his hand to knock, but the door swung open from the inside. His fist hit the empty air, leaving him frozen for a second. He looked a little embarrassed and let out a sheepish laugh. It was the perfect moment for the steward to appear. Master Qian's head servant stood there. He was the one who had opened the door. As he shouted to the people behind him, he stopped mid-sentence. Very well, he had started to say. He stared at Gao Chujue for a second as realization dawned on him. You're that young man from Gaojia village. What was your name? Gao Chujue, he replied firmly. 32's eyes darted around discreetly as he processed the situation. He understood immediately that if the sky god has the power to do as he pleases, then I must turn those desires into clear instructions. I told him, I'm all ears, which made Gao Chujue freeze up for a moment. I hadn't even said anything yet, but he already seemed to know what I was thinking. I suppose an educated person isn't like a fool like me. Usually, if the village chief wants to explain something clearly to me, He has to pull me by the ear for a long time while I scratch my head awkwardly. The sky god is asking our villagers to manufacture iron armor, because there have been too many bandits lately. They're out there stabbing people, so he wants us to have protection. But we only have one blacksmith in the entire village. And honestly, he doesn't have much talent for the craft. He's just a beginner who hasn't mastered the trade yet. Since he isn't very good, the sky god has a specific request. He wants you to find a solution and send over some competent warriors. The moment 32 heard the words, iron armor, he went completely stiff. Manufacturing iron armor in private is a crime you can't escape from. It's a crime punishable by beheading, but he was missing the point. The real issue wasn't the law, but that the people simply didn't have the skill. The most important part of that sentence was the first half. There will be many bandits in the world. Lately, they've been coming out just to stab people. 32 understood immediately. The sky god was hinting that Wang heir of Baishui is about to rebel. He had only guessed that Wang heir would revolt after stealing his friend's supplies. All those heavy grains were the first sign. But now, with these words coming directly from the sky god, he could judge the situation with 100% faith. It was a certainty. Let's go. We had to leave immediately. This was what they call dropping the helmet and abandoning the armor. His wife emerged from a room with a girl in her arms, clutching the family tree tightly. Each of them carried a large bundle filled with gold, silver, and jewels. As she stepped out, she asked in terror, "Where are we going?" I bit my lip, watching the desperation in her eyes. She grabbed Gao Chujue's hand and cried, "Brother Gao Chujue, no." Gao Chujue was startled by her sudden, frantic gesture and asked, "What's wrong?" He spoke hurriedly, "I beg you and the others sitting in this hall. Please, let these 3 young men escort my wife and daughter to Gaojia village. Please, ask the sky god to watch over them. Once my family is safe, I'll have no more worries. I will fight to the death. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Stop listening to my nonsense and just go. Shut up and move." Gao Chujue stood there, completely dazed by what was happening. But Gao Chujue has one major strength. He actually listens to people. When the village chief speaks, he follows the chief's orders. When I, the great sky god, manifest and speak, he follows my instructions. Now that 32 is speaking, he listens to 32's commands without question. He gave a wide grin, a smile from ear to ear. "Fine then, let's move." 4 young men moved out, guarding the wife and daughter of 32. Along with the servants, they formed a group of 8. They abandoned the county seat in a hurry. They were heading back to Gaojia village. The 8 of them had just cleared the city gates and traveled a short distance down the main road. Suddenly, on the hills, to the northwest of the county, hundreds of men with soot-stained faces appeared. The leader was Wang heir of Baishui, with his 2 sworn brothers, including Chong Wan, by his side. Wang heir of Baishui let out a thunderous roar, cursing the ruthless county magistrate. "That bastard wastes the sacred grain reserves and blocks our access to food. Under the rule of a man like that, we can't survive another day. Follow me. We'll storm the county and take that magistrate's dog head. We'll wipe out every rich, heartless bastard in that city and tear open the granaries. The poor will finally eat their fill. Do you have the guts to follow me?" The crowd erupted, screaming their defiance and their readiness to kill. "We all dare," they shouted, as Wang heir burst into a manic laugh. "Then what are we waiting for? Charge!" Hundreds of villagers screamed in unison, brandishing hoes, sticks, pot lids, and axes. They charged toward the county seat with whatever tools they could turn into weapons. The peasant revolt had officially begun. Wang heir led the charge, hundreds of desperate souls at his back. The 2 old soldiers guarding the city gates stood frozen in shock. Because of the Ming Dynasty's garrison system, the real troops weren't even in the city. They were stationed on farms over 10 miles away. The guards knew no reinforcements were coming to save them. Even with 100 times more courage, they wouldn't dare stand against this mob. The 2 old soldiers didn't even try to fight. They simply dropped their spears and dove into the nearby ditch to hide. They moved with maximum speed. They tore off their gear. They stripped out of their military uniforms to look like ordinary old men. Just 2 decrepit peasants. Meanwhile, the insurgent army shattered the gates and flooded in instantly. They poured into the county streets. I watched them scanning left and right. Then they sprinted through the city. They headed straight for the neighborhood where the Yang family lived. Gaozhou's wife had been planning to visit the blacksmith after her daughter left. But then the war cries echoed from the edge of town. Wang heir of Baishui had actually rebelled. She quickly tore off her fine robe and threw on a servant's coarse rags. She messed up her hair until it was a tangled nest. She transformed herself completely. She looked like a middle-aged beggar with a face covered in filth. Only then did she slip out of the house. She moved randomly through the narrow back alleys. And that's when she saw them. Wang heir was leading hundreds of rebels directly toward the very neighborhood where the Yang family lived. A little later, she arrived at Young Grand Street, a dark, narrow alley lined with crumbling shacks. Sewage ran through the gutters everywhere. Everyone living here was a common laborer. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and potters, all of them dirt poor. Sanchawar took a deep breath. She knocked on a blacksmith's door while the peasant rebellion brewed outside. The blacksmith was hiding inside, trembling so hard he was ready to bolt. He grabbed a knife. He approached the door until he heard Sanchawar's soft voice and finally found the courage to open it. "Master Sanchawar, why are you here and why are you dressed like that?" She slipped inside quickly and slammed the door shut. The rebels are causing absolute chaos out there, she whispered. That's why I had to disguise myself. She lowered her voice even further. Don't worry about those rebels for now. They aren't here to kill you. At most, they'll kill the county magistrate, the clerk, and the record keepers. Once they've dealt with the officials and the local elites, they'll loot the granary. It's not our turn yet. Blacksmith, do you know why I came to you? She asked. I knew this man was a hidden gem in the history of technology. He was the best blacksmith in Chinchin County, even if the officials treated him like dirt. I'm the only one who truly recognizes your skill. That's what I call spotting real talent. This man, Li Da, is the finest blacksmith in Chinchin County, having forged countless weapons for the garrison. He produced high-quality armor for the inspector, a military official of the 9th rank. Every inspector has over 100 soldiers under his command, but there's a problem. The imperial court doesn't give a damn about craftsmen. No matter how good your technique is, an artisan is considered lower than a commoner. The county magistrate won't even look at a craftsman, let alone care about the quality of his work. Only the clerk, the man who helps the magistrate manage the county, pays any attention. In fact, I knew Sanchuer was a good person who often spoke up for the common folk. She was always looking out for the poor and the downtrodden. Old man Lee had been looked after by her many times before. If it weren't for that, he never would have opened his door in the middle of a rebellion. He had hesitated, but finally let her inside the shack. Lita looked at her, his face flushing with a bit of embarrassment. It's true. Only you, Master Sanchuer, truly understand my craft, he muttered. He knew his skills were wasted in this rotting alleyway. Sanchuer looked him straight in the eye. I know you're dirt poor and that you've always dreamed of making a fortune. Well, right now, I am giving you that chance. Come with me and work as a private blacksmith for a very powerful master. He's incredibly wealthy. Do you want to go? Lita stood there, completely stunned by her words. A master who is very, very rich. You'd be his private blacksmith, but I knew as an artisan, escaping without permission was nearly impossible. Sanchuer pointed toward the door, her eyes sharp. The rebels are causing chaos outside, slaughtering people everywhere. Use this. If you run now, no soldier will notice you're missing. No one will come looking for you. They'll just assume you were hacked to pieces. Blame it on the rebels. From now on, you can leave this stress behind. Forget being a lowly artisan. Follow this new master and work for him. If you do a good job and keep him happy, he might get you a new huku and wipe your record clean. Lido was instantly tempted. His ancestors had been captured and forced into this life. For generations, his family had been stuck as miserable, low-class craftsmen. He was still single because no woman wanted to marry a man of his status. Listening to Sanchuer's pitch, he saw a chance to finally redeem himself. But men like him were simple-minded and naive. He had no idea what it felt like to be played for a fool. He had zero experience being tricked and sold off like cattle. It's easy to convince someone when they're desperate, especially when someone with a solid reputation like Sanchuer is doing the talking. Lito was sold. He muttered, could this really be happening? Can I really have a good life? I believe you, Sanchuer. Let's go. Let's move, and let's move fast. The rebels were tearing the city apart, and the officials were terrified. They were all cowering inside the county yamen, including Zhou Chenbin. With them hiding, a nobody like Li Dai could actually slip away. If he didn't leave before the rebels calmed down, his children would be born into slavery too. Those words hit him like a physical blow. He gritted his teeth and made his choice. Take me to see this great master. Sanchuer was ecstatic. The blacksmith had been played perfectly. I, Sanchuer, had used every bit of my silver tongue to lie and manipulate. I finally helped the great sky god trick a blacksmith into his service. My position as his loyal servant was finally secure. It was 1,000 times better than being a lackey for a local magistrate. The screams of the dying still echoed through the county streets. The slaughter was concentrated mainly around the government office. The heart of the county was drowning in blood. The wealthy district was next, and the noise confirmed the county yamen had fallen. The screams of death had already spread to the courtyards of the rich. It sounded like the guards and watchmen were still putting up a fight. They were locked in a desperate struggle with the rebels. Every so often, the wailing of women pierced through the chaos. I, Sanchuer, didn't even need to look to know what was happening. Countless women were about to be brutally violated. They would be humiliated and broken in this madness. I thought specifically of Miss Wan and her personal servants. Every one of them had beautiful features and pale, delicate skin, now prey for the rebels. I couldn't help but let out a long, heavy sigh. The government was wrong for hoarding the food and starving the people. But these women, what was their crime? Did they deserve to be the spoils of war? The government is corrupt and heartless. But the rebels aren't any better. In reality, there are only two types of people in this world. The ones who hold the power and the ones who suffer for it. Things happen without regret. That is simply the way of the world. I grabbed Li Da by the arm and hissed, let's go. Hurry before the rebels get closer. They'll move on once they finish slaughtering the wealthy landowners. The chaos will spread here soon. So I ran down the street at full speed. The city gates were already standing wide open. There wasn't a single detail I didn't know about this place. I had spent my days watching over this city. The moment we crossed the gate, Lida looked relieved to finally be free from the authorities. While the county was in total turmoil, construction on the Gaojia village gate hit a snag. The issue wasn't just the technology or the design itself. The real problem came down to Li Daoxian's ropes. The city wall being built was massive, high, thick, and incredibly wide. Even the gate, though intentionally kept small, was still a significant size. It stood 6 meters high and 6 meters wide, requiring massive logs to be secured. The villagers tried tying them together, but their straw ropes kept slipping. The quality just wasn't there, and they didn't have nearly enough. Straw rope was already a luxury, and every inch was handmade by the villagers. The manufacturing process they used was as primitive as it gets. The texture was coarse and rough, barely fit for basic tasks. They worked for tying table legs or securing a plow, but that was it. But for a project of this scale, using those ropes to secure heavy logs was a recipe for a total catastrophe. The ropes here have snapped again, village chief. The ropes the master brought us. They break with even the slightest tug. Who's going to secure those 2 wing posts now? They're going to collapse. The villagers were reaching their breaking point. I watched the little people outside rushing around in a total panic for over an hour. Because those 2 ropes snapped, the logs they had tied in rows came crashing down. Poor little guys, they have to be so incredibly careful. Now they have to start all over, so I wondered, how can I help them? My gaze drifted across the cluttered items in my house. Suddenly, I spotted my bag of fishing tackle gathering dust in a corner. A light bulb practically went off over my head. Fishing line, that was the answer. I clearly remembered studying the different specs for a long time when I bought it. I had some size 0.4 fishing line with a diameter of only 0.104 millimeters. Even if I put it in the box and it scaled up 200 times, it would only be 2 centimeters thick. Compared to the villagers' straw ropes, the quality was like night and day. Down below, Gaoi was desperately braiding grass, looking completely miserable. But when he heard the call of the sky god, he snapped his head up with a glowing expression. His small, handsome face looked up at me as he called out, "Great sky god, what can I do for you?" he asked. So I told him to take this rope and have everyone use it. I told them to use it to secure the gate, then I cut a length of my fishing line. It was the size 0.4 line I had found earlier. I let it drop slowly into the box, and Gaoi hurriedly called the villagers over. They all craned their necks and watched a transparent rope descend from the heavens. It drifted down slowly, appearing only about as thick as a finger to them. To their eyes, it looked exactly like a thick, cooked rice noodle. The villagers looked at each other in complete confusion. They wondered what this strange rope was, but Gaoi shouted that the sky god had commanded them. He told them to use it to lash the wood together for the gate. The crowd's hearts were filled with doubt as they stared at the thin strand. But despite their skepticism, not a single person moved to leave. No one dared to voice their concerns to a god. Only when that rice noodle hit the ground and they touched it with their own hands did they realize. Their faces instantly shifted into expressions of pure shock. This clear rope was incredibly strong, far tougher than any grass they had braided. I watched them realize that this finger-thick string was a miracle. It was stronger than a grass rope the size of a man's arm. Gaoi barked at them to get a knife, cut a piece, and test it on the wood immediately. They brought out their knives to try and cut the line. But this fishing line is high-quality stuff. The villagers' dull blades stood no chance against it. They really had to put their backs into it. Finally, sweating profusely, they managed to hack off a piece. However, the harder it was to cut, the stronger it proved to be, and they excitedly gathered more from the ground. They used it to lash 2 heavy pieces of wood together. Then, they split into 2 groups and pulled from opposite sides, desperately trying to snap the strand. No matter how much they strained, the fishing line didn't even stretch. It was clear that this material was on a completely different level. It's stronger than any rope. Could this be a divine cord used by the gods? Someone blurted that out, and suddenly, the faces of everyone nearby went pale. Damn it, we just cut a divine cord. We're in for it now. Gaoi quickly stepped in, asking, "Didn't the sky god say it wasn't a divine cord?" He said it's just a toy to him. He told us to use it however we want. It doesn't matter if we break it. I watched as the villagers fell into a stunned silence at that news. They became even more reverent, wondering how powerful a real god-slaying rope must be if this was just my toy. Right then, several villagers were about to kneel again, so I scolded them irritably. "Don't spend all day kneeling. Use your time wisely." Gaoi started mimicking Gao's mother to get them to do serious work. He scolded the laughing villagers until the fireman stood up and joined the construction. With high-quality rope in hand, everyone started working much faster. In no time, they lashed a row of tree trunks together to form a circular frame. They raised the wooden palisade, and it transformed into a massive structure. The gate was 2 spans high and 1 span wide, needing only a few final cuts. They just had to finish 2 door leaves exactly like that. Once finished, they'd have a city gate that could actually open and close. Suddenly, the villager standing guard atop the wall shouted at the top of his lungs, "Gao Shugu and the others are back, and they've brought outsiders." The villagers dropped their tools and rushed to the gate to see the spectacle. I shifted my gaze directly toward the outskirts of Sanwan village. Sure enough, Gao Shugu was the first one to come sprinting into the settlement. Right behind him followed a man wearing a mysterious, heavy jacket. Then came a pale, stout middle-aged woman leading a young girl. Beside the 10-year-old girl stood a guard in armor, clutching a weapon tightly. He stayed close, clearly protecting the child at his side. Bringing up the rear were 3 more young men from our village. It was a group of 8 people, their faces filled with panic and desperation. They were sprinting toward the center of the settlement. When Gao Shugu and his group left the village early this morning, I hadn't yet placed the walls built from those Lego bricks. Inside the display box, Gao Shugu and the others had no idea the village had changed. They saw from a distance that their home looked completely different. It was surrounded by a strange, towering, multicolored giant wall. They panicked, wondering what on earth had happened to their home. Fortunately, the situation calmed down quickly. The sentry at the gate waved his hand and shouted, "Gao Shugu, you're back." Gao Shugu saw familiar faces and finally felt a wave of relief. He kept running, shouting back, "What happened to the village?" Gaoi laughed and scolded him. "What do you mean strange? This wall is a gift from the great god. How dare you call it strange? If the great god stops feeding you, I'll be waiting to watch you cry." Gao Shugu's face went pale at those words. He immediately looked up and started shouting toward the sky. "Great god, I was wrong. I'm just a complete idiot. Everything I say is just nonsense. I wasn't about to get angry over something so small. I was actually having a blast watching him." Gao Shugu and his group quickly hurried through the gap in the wall where the gate would be. They slipped into the village, bringing 4 newcomers along with them. There were 3 women and 1 man, all looking incredibly timid. Their eyes darted around cautiously, taking in the people and their new surroundings. Finally, their gaze locked onto the massive, towering wall of the city. Gao Shugu turned to Gao Yi and spoke up quickly. He explained that these 4 were the wives and slaves of Shan Qiu and his brother. He looked at her with a pleading expression. He had gone to find a blacksmith for me, and he wanted me to look after his family. Gao Yi lifted her head, preparing to look up at me. But before she could ask for my opinion, Li Daoxian spoke first. He pointed out that a certain family had been killed by bandits, leaving their house empty. He suggested taking the newcomers there to settle into that room. Gao Yi nodded and led them toward the shelter. Her expression was gentle and welcoming as she guided them. "Thank you," one of them whispered. "Thank you so much," said another. The gratitude in their voices was thick with relief. They were clearly terrified, but they knew they were safe now. It was obvious to them that Gao Yi was a kind soul. As they walked, one of the women gathered her courage and asked, "Miss, what's going on in your Gao village? How can there be such a thing? A wall this massive, it's much more impressive than the one in the county capital." Gao Yi smiled at her words. "This wall is a gift from the great sky god," she explained. "Our village is protected by him, and we possess many divine artifacts. Since you've come here now, you will see it all soon enough." The third lady stood there, completely stunned by the mention of divine protection. The journey of over 30 li to get here had been brutal. For a middle-aged woman who wasn't used to physical labor, every step had been a struggle. It was nothing short of pure, hellish torture. Several times along the way, she felt like collapsing right there on the road. She just wanted to lie on the ground and never move again. But she knew the city wasn't far behind them. The screams and the sounds of battle echoing from the city haunted her. She grit her teeth and kept following the tall, thin man leading the way. Now that they had finally arrived, she looked around. It seemed like just a small, isolated village at first glance. If not for those strange, multicolored walls, she wouldn't have seen anything remarkable. The third lady was silently cursing her husband in her heart. But then, she stopped. She raised her head and noticed a row of drying racks in the clearing ahead. Countless strips of salted meat were hanging there, drying in the wind. Normally, this wouldn't be anything out of the ordinary. But the sheer volume of meat was staggering. The racks were packed densely together. They stretched all the way toward the center of the village. As far as the eye could see, a sea of meat covered the area. Seeing an entire zone filled with these racks felt surreal. It was a massive, industrial-scale production of dried meat. The third lady stood there, completely dumbfounded by the sight. Weren't the peasants supposed to be starving and on the verge of rebellion? How could they have so much meat just sitting out here? They even had enough salt to marinate every single piece. It was simply unbelievable. Her servants were just as stunned, their eyes glued to the food. Gao Yi ignored their shock and led them to a building up ahead. "You can stay in this house for the time being," she said, pointing to a resting area. The third lady looked at the dilapidated shack and felt a surge of disgust. Once they left, they would head straight back to the district city. So she kept her mouth shut, while Gao Yuya heard my voice echoing in her mind again. I told her, "This isn't like the city. Money won't buy you a meal here. Give them 2 grains of rice, a small vegetable leaf, and a strip of meat, and some salt, so they can actually fill their stomachs." Following my instructions, Gao Yuya brought the supplies from her house. When she presented the meager rations to the third lady, the woman froze in terror. "What kind of rice is this?" she stammered. "Why is it so massive?" She stared at the salt crystals, which looked like giant ingots of white silver. Gao Yuya looked her in the eye and didn't hold back. "I told you before, Gao village is full of divine artifacts," she said firmly. "This rice and salt are mysterious gifts from the great sky god himself. Accept them with nothing but gratitude." The third lady realized she was dealing with something beyond her understanding. She quickly pressed her hands together and bowed low. She bowed twice toward the sky before scurrying away to hide the food. I watched from above, satisfied that she had no other options for now. Gao Yuya ignored the third lady's group and stepped out of the house. She began walking toward the main gates of the village. Behind her, the third lady's servants were already begging to return to the city. I watched as the third lady ordered Tess and Ijijin to clean the room. With the servants fixing the bed, she found herself with nothing left to do. She took her daughter's hand and stepped out of the house for a walk. As they strolled through the village, she saw the massive walls surrounding them. The colorful structures gave her an inexplicable sense of security, but it was the sight of the giant chicken strips that stopped her cold. Seeing them piled in the open space near the house shocked her all over again. That wasn't all. She soon came across an immense pond. It was filled to the brim with crystal-clear water, a sight that seemed impossible. We were in the middle of a great drought, with rivers dried up and crops dying everywhere. Yet here, a pond this large existed right before her eyes. Suddenly, a rhythmic shouting echoed from the direction of the village gates. 1, 2, 3, the villagers yelled in unison. The sound of their straining voices carried through the air. The third lady turned and saw a group of 4 or 5 villagers pushing with all their might. They were hauling a massive gate they had just finished lashing together. They were struggling to hoist the heavy frame into its place at the entrance. The gate was crafted from solid stone and timber, making it incredibly heavy. Suddenly, one villager's foot slipped on the dirt. The giant gate groaned once before it began to tilt dangerously to the side. The gate was about to crush the old village chief as the others rushed toward him. The villagers let out a collective scream, terrifying the third lady and her daughter. But in that split second, the massive city gate simply froze midair, refusing to fall or strike anyone. The villagers stood there, locked in their panicked poses like statues. They were stunned into silence until, after a few breaths, a booming voice echoed like a plane overhead. The great sky god has reached down and caught the gate, someone shouted at the top of their lungs. Don't just stand there. Hurry up and lift it. Sui Ruo sprinted toward the gate with everything he had. He reached out to help support the heavy structure. He'd been eating well and growing fast lately, his arms already showing lean muscle. The moment he joined the group holding the frame, the weight shifted. The other men felt the crushing pressure vanish instantly. The rest of the young men rushed in to help as well. Together, they heaved upward with a unified shout. They guided the gate carefully into its designated opening. Once it was secured firmly in place, they all let out a massive sigh of relief. The third lady watched the scene from a distance, rubbing her eyes in disbelief. She could have sworn she saw a giant, invisible hand reach down from the clouds to hold that gate steady. It was falling. Oh my God, it was falling. The third lady was a devout follower. She spent her life visiting Taoist temples and churches alike. She would burn incense for the heavens and make constant donations. She'd offer up small prayers and memorized various sacred Taoist scriptures. She recited formulas and mantras, hoping for a miracle to strike. Her chanting was mediocre, but her lifelong devotion was undeniable. Yet, in all those years, she had never actually seen a god manifest. Until now, she didn't hesitate for a second and dropped to her knees. With a heavy thud, she pressed her forehead against the dusty ground. She screamed, "The great sky god has appeared. Your disciple is honored to see you." As the sun began to set, Saint Cyr arrived with a new face in tow. The blacksmith, Li Dasui, had been successfully tricked into coming along. They had used the chaos of the moment to make their escape. After fleeing the college, they headed straight for the lady's house. They ran all the way toward Gaojia village without stopping. It was a trek of over 30 li, mostly through rugged mountain terrain. The path was brutal and difficult to navigate by the time they arrived. Exhausted, hungry, and parched, they finally collapsed, gasping, "We made it. We're finally here. It's just up ahead." They looked toward Gaojia village, which had changed so much in just a few days. And there it was, another 5-meter-high wall standing tall. It was truly incredible. This is what I'd call daily progress. Li Dasui had walked the entire way, feeling more uneasy with every step. The path grew desolate, the people vanished, and doubt began to cloud his heart. But the moment he saw that 5-colored wall, he froze in his tracks. He stood there stunned before a wave of delight hit him. What a majestic sight. It towered over the landscape, proving my control over this world was absolute. It showed that the great lord ruling here was incredibly powerful. I had even painted vibrant colors across the stone surface. To him, it was proof that I was wealthy enough to throw money around, on purely decorative whims. Even though I've only been at this for a short time, calling a place with 6-meter walls a village wasn't exactly accurate anymore. With walls that high, how could anyone dare call it a mere village instead of a city? But if it really was just a village, then it was a hidden treasure. Li Dasui asked curiously, "I've never heard of a great lord from the Gao family in these parts." "This lord is called the Great Sky God," they replied. I watched as a selection prompt appeared right over Li Dasui's head. A massive question mark slowly materialized above him. "If you want to enter, ask fewer questions, watch more, and don't offend the great lord. If they kick you out, I won't be able to help you." That's what I call walking on eggshells. Li Dasui wasn't exactly the naive type. He was a bit of a shrewd character. He had dealt with officials, nobles, and clans, making him a veteran of the world. He understood that when entering an important house, you talk less and observe more. He nodded quickly and said, "I understand." Gao Er led the way, and the two of them passed through the walls one after another. They entered through the gates of Gao Village. Only one city gate had been built so far, and there wouldn't be time to finish the other today. The scene looked like something straight out of a video game. It was almost ridiculous. Lee Dasui thought to himself that this city was brand new, noting that even the gates weren't finished yet. No wonder the Great Lord was in such a hurry to find a blacksmith. I thought, this is my chance to finally show off my talent here. He was still lost in that thought when the workers sitting nearby startled him. They were eating right under the archway, holding large, coarse bowls, and every single bowl was overflowing with pure white rice. Cabbage leaves and chicken soup filled their bowls to the brim. They were shoveling down the white rice like there was no tomorrow. Lee Dasui froze, his mind racing. What kind of wealth did this great lord actually possess? Even the common laborers were eating like royalty. I once forged armor for a county magistrate and didn't get a meal half this good. Then he noticed the physical condition of the workers. It didn't make any sense after 3 years of brutal drought. Usually, the people he encountered were walking skeletons. In this broken society, most commoners were so emaciated that they looked like they'd collapse from a single cough or the slightest gust of wind. But these workers were sturdy and full of energy. It was completely abnormal. He had no idea I had been feeding this village a steady supply of rice, meat, vegetables, salt, and clean water. Lee Dasui wanted to say something, but Gao Er's warning echoed in his head. He bit his tongue and kept walking, though the shock was eating him alive. Gao Er led him straight to Old Man Gao and bowed respectfully. "I've brought him, Elder," he said with a smile. He introduced the blacksmith, hoping to impress the village leader. I was also having dinner at that exact moment. I held a bowl of rice noodles with pickled vegetables and shredded meat while watching the display box. I saw Sangseer and Li Dagong walking in together. Looking down into the miniature world, I watched them approach. They headed straight toward Old Man Gao. Sangseer was beaming with joy, looking like the god had just blessed his hard work. Lee Dasui stood there, looking tense. Old Man Gao prepared to ask some serious questions, his tone shifting instantly. He signaled for Sangseer to make the formal introductions. The village elder wanted to know exactly who this blacksmith was. Sangseer didn't waste a second. He rushed forward to speak. He introduced the man as Lee Dasui. He called him the finest blacksmith in all of Changshan County. He forged armor for the county inspector and weapons for the frontline soldiers. Most of the high-quality gear came from his hands. He was a true master craftsman. Lee Dasui realized they shared the same surname, Lee. He felt grateful hearing Sangseer put in such a good word for him to the elder, but he was still slightly puzzled by the situation. Master Sangseer was a man of high status in the county, so why was he acting like this? He was bowing before a little girl dressed like a common villager. Lee Dasui's gaze fixed intently on little Lee. "Lee, can you manufacture iron armor?" they asked, questioning his specialty. I watched him perk up with pride, boasting that he'd been in the artillery office since childhood and could forge anything. You have to admire that kind of confidence. Lee Dasui was beaming as he asked if I also knew how to make prototypes. "Yes, I do," I thought, watching the scene unfold. He responded with total certainty, claiming he could even make a three-eyed musket. Not bad at all, that's a solid technique. It looked like he was capable of teaching others. He could show the villagers how to mass-produce iron armor. Of course, doing that was technically an act of rebellion. He got nervous for a split second, but then he caught himself. What did a little rebellion matter compared to this? The fact that they were doing this proved they had the strength to help him regain his status as a free citizen. I decided to give Lee Dasui an additional task to test his limits. A confident smile played at the corners of his lips when he heard the request. An extra task? He didn't think it would be a problem at all. There wasn't a single weapon or piece of armor he didn't know how to forge. It didn't matter how complex the design was. He was ready. "It's nothing but a pile of scrap metal," he boasted. "If I just put in the time, I can forge anything." He wasn't intimidated by a simple villager like Gao Yai at all. He bowed low and offered his thanks. He thanked them again and again. The gratitude seemed endless. He was truly desperate for this chance. He kept repeating his thanks to the little girl. He said he would be infinitely grateful if his family could be saved. He just wanted his descendants to escape their status as lowly outcasts. His confidence was high, and I decided not to be overly polite with my next move. I picked up a sheet of A5 paper and placed it in the empty space behind the city gate. A large group of villagers was busy eating nearby. When they saw a massive, strange white sheet fall from the sky, they scattered while clutching their rice bowls. They started laughing and shouting, "The great sky god! What strange thing is he sending us now?" "Look again," another cried. "This time it looks like something we can't eat." The A5 paper landed flat on the ground like a giant monument. It covered the dirt, revealing a complex series of patterns. I had drawn strange, intricate designs all over it for them to follow. Gao Yai pointed at the paper and told him to look closely at the musket design. He looked him in the eye and said, "What's on this paper is exactly what you need to do. You need to manufacture this." Lito watched the massive sheet fall suddenly from the empty sky. He stood there, completely stunned for a long time, until Shang grabbed him. Shang gripped his shoulder and shook him twice to snap him out of it. Suddenly, he jolted awake from his trance. Standing on the flat ground, Lita could only see the paper from a side profile. He could make out a few loose parts, but he couldn't see the whole picture. His only choice was to climb the 6-meter-high wall to look down at the sheet. From above, the center of the paper revealed something incredible. It was a type of musket he had never seen before, surrounded by patterns of every individual part. Every single component of the weapon was laid bare. Lita Oxwan laughed as he realized these were detailed diagrams and explanations. It was the Interim rifle, a perfect example of the first breech-loading rifles. And this was its complete blueprint. In reality, Lita Oxwan hadn't been idle over the last few days. He hadn't stopped thinking about the nuances of the materials I had provided. He considered me a great friend, and the man felt a surge of inspiration. The skill level of these Ming Dynasty craftsmen is incredibly high. I wondered what kind of weapons they could actually build with the right guidance. I even posted an anonymous message on a military history forum I frequent. I asked, if you traveled back to the Ming era, what would be the best weapon to make? Given Ming blacksmiths and modern raw materials, what's the maximum they could produce? The first response said, just make a sword for cutting wood. The second response was, ignore that guy, you should obviously make an AK-47. An AK-47. Any family workshop can manufacture one nowadays. In the Ming era, you could probably hammer one out by hand too. The third response chimed in, don't be stupid. What's the point of just making the outer shell? Without precision, the barrel will explode every time you pull the trigger. Not to mention the ammo problem. A rifled musket is much more reliable. Every great time traveler uses rifled muskets for a reason. Then came the fourth response. The guy above seems to have forgotten a key detail. The author said he has access to modern raw materials. If you have modern materials, you have rubber to solve the sealing issues. So why not skip the basic rifled musket entirely and jump straight to a breech-loading rifle? The Interim rifle is a great choice. The precision requirements aren't as high as an automatic, so Ming blacksmiths could actually build it. Then came the fifth response. You guys are missing the point of going back in time. In the Ming era, you obviously buy a few maidservants first. Then you lift their skirts and watch them bathe in secret. They can't resist their master anyway, so you can have your way with them in 18 different ways. I looked at the username. It was that guy again. Every other response immediately started dogpiling the creep. Get the hell out of this military history forum. Ignoring the chaos, I took note of a specific Tibetan flintlock rifle. I decided to level up my strategy. With the help of the forum members, I gathered everything I needed. I downloaded photos, blueprints, and detailed shots of every single part. I printed them all out on an A5 sheet of paper. Now, I just had to wait for the craftsman Lida. Back on the walls of San Francisco City, in the center of the miniature world, Lida was staring at the paper with absolute intensity. He kept glancing back and forth, studying every detail. He turned the paper over, staring at it from every angle until he was drenched in sweat. If this musket could actually be built, it would change everything. I told him, don't pressure yourself, Lida. Just give it your best shot. Try to make it happen. I can give you all the time in the world, even if it's just a few minutes for me. Years don't matter to me, as long as you actually succeed. I will make your dream come true. For Lida, that dream was his only reality. He wanted to be a free man, but after hearing Gao Yuanyuan's words, he knew it wasn't simple. He still looked uncertain and couldn't help but shout out. Master Shang, it's not that I don't trust you. It's just that what I'm about to do isn't exactly ordinary. I don't even know who this great master really is. I had filled that paper with everything I knew, but Gao Yuanyuan still didn't get it. Gao Yuanyuan yelled, jump off the wall and try it. Then you'll know who the great master is. Lida panicked at the thought of jumping, healing, and leaving his home behind. I couldn't help but laugh at the scene. Jump and see, I thought, as Lida looked down from the high city wall. The wall of San Francisco was massive. Did he really need to prove his worth like this? He had the courage. He'd worked iron all year, and his body was still strong. But jumping from that height was a different story. I watched him closely, hoping he'd be careful when he landed. At that distance, he was bound to get hurt. Lida clenched his fists tight. He looked at the city wall as if it were a barrier to his future. To him, jumping to earn a promotion meant gambling with his life. He was ready to risk it all. I'm going for it, he muttered, gritting his teeth as he stepped forward. He leaped, launching himself off the edge into the open air. He was already planning to roll upon impact to break the force. But the moment he cleared the wall, something changed. Before gravity could even pull him down, he felt something solid supporting him beneath his feet. The shock of it caught him completely off guard. He stumbled, his hands pressing against an invisible, firm surface. It felt as if he had landed right in the center of a giant palm. I lowered him gently through the air toward his father's house. To Lida, it felt like he was flying through the sky. Thank you, he whispered, breathless. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. But his posture was a total mess, hardly the graceful landing I expected. This didn't look like flying at all, and I remembered what 32 had told him before entering the village. He said the most notable figure in this place was the god, and right now, we were in a tight spot. Lida had been completely perplexed back then. He hadn't understood a word 32 said, but now, the realization was starting to sink in. I let Lida slide slowly down from my hand. He touched down on the ground, his body trembling as he slipped. He slumped onto the yellow dirt, a look of pure horror plastered across his face. His expression was full of panic, yet I could see a spark of joy in his heart. That joy came from knowing his dream was finally within reach. He took a moment to pull himself together. He shifted from a seated position and dropped straight onto his knees. "This humble servant," he shouted at the top of his lungs. "I swear I will do everything in my power to manufacture it. I will make the musket you have ordered, though it seems unbelievable. It is a bit complicated, and as a humble servant of the church, it might take a very long time." I told him it could take a year or two, because if he finished it in days, he'd be a miracle worker. If he handed a finished rifle to 32 that fast, I'd swear he was a time traveler with a cheat system. Lida knew, of course, just how important this task was. I told him, "Take it slow, there's no rush, just teach Gao Yi how to forge armor while you study. Work on this musket piece by piece, and have Gao Yi report to me for any materials you need." In short, the day he finally succeeded in manufacturing it would be the day his dream finally became a reality. I turned my attention back to Gao Yi in the village. "Are there any empty houses left?" I asked, and Gao Yi looked down. He looked a bit embarrassed and said there were none left. The only habitable empty house had already been assigned to 32. I looked at Gao Yi and Li Da and told them to wait a moment while I reached into my fridge. I pulled out a cold can of Pepsi. I chugged it down in a few greedy gulps and let out a satisfied burp. Then, I grabbed some scissors and rinsed the can with a little water. I cut the can in half, forming a small metal cylinder. I carefully trimmed out a tiny door and 2 small windows in the side. I took that half can and placed it upside down in an open space in the village. Bang! A massive thud echoed through the village as the ground began to tremble. Suddenly, a strange, cylindrical blue house with vibrant colors appeared in the corner of the village. The simplified Pepsi logo on the side looked like some kind of ancient, divine script to them. The upside-down can looked ridiculous to me, but to them, it was a marvel. I told Lida, "You'll live in this temporary cabin for now. In time, I'll provide better housing for everyone." The villagers had seen plenty of miracles by now, but they were still so stunned they nearly dropped their bowls at the sight of the sky god's architecture. The third lady, watching from the shadows, began prostrating herself like a rhythmic mortar. Now, to keep the story moving smoothly, I should mention that the large A5 paper from before was recovered that same night. I replaced it with a smaller, printed version to save space. It was a necessary adjustment, mostly because the risk of wasting materials was too high, and that specific detail wasn't relevant to the bigger picture. I appreciate you guys sticking with the story. I didn't want these minor logistics to ruin the reading experience. So, I often gloss over these unimportant technicalities. I'll leave those small trifles to your imagination, dear readers. The house was there, but the Tinkin home was completely empty. There wasn't a single piece of furniture inside. The village chief brought in a large bundle of hay, setting it down to serve as a temporary bed for Lida. He even lent him an old blanket while Gao Yangyang brought a bowl of chicken and cabbage. Lida finally enjoyed a delicious meal while everyone busied themselves around him. Master 32 recounted everything that had happened earlier, realizing just how powerless they would have been on their own. Outside, the sky over the miniature land began to fade, turning completely dark as night fell over the box. Lida and the others took a scrap sheet of metal, using it as a makeshift barrier for the village entrance. It would have to serve as a temporary gate for the unfinished wall. With the village secured, the residents finally headed home to rest. Inside the box, the village of Yen was finally still. Seeing nothing left to monitor, I finally looked away from the display. I stood up and glanced out my own window. The Chihuahua sky was already pitch black, but the city below sparkled with 1,000 lights as the nightlife began. I sat back down at my computer and clicked the screen to life. I checked the chat with Kaisa Z and asked how the kiln was coming along. She replied that they were still setting up the scaffolding and to check back in a month. I knew the design was complicated, so I didn't want to pressure her. Instead, I opened my favorite military history forum to post anonymously. I posed a question. If you traveled back to the end of the Ming Dynasty with a fortress and cannons, and you've already secured your safety, what is the very next thing you should do? Response 1 said, go out and pick up more girls. Don't let the good girls down. And as for the bad ones, put them in their place. I scrolled down to response 2. Moderator, please come ban this idiot from the first comment. I've been putting up with his nonsense for way too long. Response 3 was much darker. Start killing. Kill the opium smokers, the corrupt politicians, the bandits, and the invaders. Then, with a group of loyal followers, build a new empire and crush the West. I looked at response 4. If you don't have grand ambitions, then just live. I smiled, thinking about Wang Wei and how he had stolen the official grain. He did it immediately, without hesitation. He wasn't just returning a favor, he was taking charge. It's no wonder a man with that kind of charisma could lead a peasant rebellion. People are willing to risk their lives for you, just like the people of Gaojia village. Wang Wei shouted twice more, and a man in black appeared on the wall. He stood at the edge of the city, brandishing a weapon. Holding a torch with a simple air, he looked out from the wall. So, you're the one who's going to kill me, you water thief? Wang Wei felt a pang of embarrassment. Fortunately, the night was pitch black. The only light came from the flickering torches. No one noticed his slight blush as he said, I'm the one who stole it, but now isn't the time. Please, open the city gates. I'm sending you 2 carts of food, and then I must leave immediately. The guard was simple-minded, the type who couldn't judge a situation for himself. Without direct orders, he was paralyzed. As the guard hesitated, I took a moment to reflect. I decided those 2 carts of food absolutely could not be accepted. I couldn't allow Wang Wei's group to enter Gaojia village yet. This is only the beginning of the peasant uprising, and the world is still relatively stable. The imperial court's control is still far too strong. If Gaojia village gets involved with Wang Wei now, it will bring nothing but trouble. My fragile village can't survive that kind of heat just yet. I was about to wake up Gao Yueying so she could deliver my message, when suddenly, another figure appeared. A man climbed up the city walls. It was number 32. He gave Gao Siwei a firm pat on the shoulder. He signaled for him to stay quiet, and then shouted down to Wang Wei, standing right there outside the city walls. Friend Wang, we in Gaojia village appreciate the gesture, but you're out there rebelling. The government troops are right on your heels, and you're running for your lives. If our village takes you in, those 2 carts of food won't actually change our lives. Without them, our lives won't get any worse either. To us, it's just a bonus, but to you, those supplies are everything. Isn't that food the only capital you have to escape and survive? It's far more important for you to keep them. I laughed to myself. This guy, number 32, is actually pretty sharp. With him around, I don't have to worry as much about the village's affairs. After hearing number 32's words, Wang Wei began to hesitate and look unsure. Beside him, another rebel leader named Cheng Wandao whispered, Brother Wang, what this man is saying actually makes a lot of sense. Since Gaojia village gave you all that flour last time, they clearly aren't starving. But we're heading into the mountains next, and we are seriously running low on food. Another rebel leader, Sheng Liangfu, chimed in, Brother Wang, this debt can wait. We can come back and settle this once we've established a base. Look at the way Gaojia village is acting. They clearly want nothing to do with us. Wang Wei, the one-legged dragon, paused and thought it over. He realized the village didn't seem to care about his supposed gift at all. He was a man of action, so he didn't waste any more time hesitating. He looked up at the city wall and shouted, Fine, if that's how it is, I won't force it. I'll remember this favor, he said, then waved his hand and ordered his men to move out. Number 32 watched him start to leave and suddenly called out, Hero Wang. Wang Wei stopped in his tracks and turned around. Number 32 leaned over the wall and asked in a low, dragging voice, What happened to the women from the wealthy families back in the county? Wang Wei froze instantly, looking like he'd been struck by a bolt of lightning. He stood there for several seconds before turning to glare at Cheng Wandao and Sheng Liangfu. He shot them a look of pure disgust and then turned back toward the wall. He gave number 32 a final salute and marched away into the darkness. I watched from above as the man quickly disappeared into the night. He was heading back in the same direction he came from last time, back when he tried to steal our water toward Wanya village. I wasn't sure exactly how far that was from Gaojia village, but I had the technology to find out. After the brief commotion died down, Gaojia village finally returned to its usual calm. Number 32 climbed down from the top of the high city wall. A large crowd of villagers had gathered behind him, woken up by Wang Wei shouting. Only a few of them had actually made it up to the wall to see what was happening. Number 32 started scolding them. You people in Gaojia village are too soft. You have a wall, but you have absolutely no defense. We got lucky that it was Wang Wei who showed up tonight. He shouted at the top of his lungs and woke us up to talk. If it had been real bandits, they would have moved in silence. They would have used hooks and ropes to scale the wall and slit our throats in our sleep. I realized number 32 was saying exactly what I was thinking. The village chief shook his head and sighed. We do have sentries at night, but we don't have lanterns, and lighting up this whole wall would take dozens of them. I frowned at the screen, realizing they simply couldn't afford the oil. Gaojia village is protected by a god. Tomorrow morning, everyone needs to kneel. Pray to the heavens for the oil to arrive. The villagers thought about it carefully. It was true, the god liked to drop food whenever the earth trembled. If there was nothing else they could do, they could at least do that. If they all prostrated themselves before him, maybe they'd get what they needed. Just a little bit of oil. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry watching them. Why wait until tomorrow morning? I can give them the oil right now, so I headed into my kitchen. I grabbed a large jug of vegetable oil. I found a spare water bottle cap, planning to fill it up. I was ready to place the oil inside the box. But before I could, I saw an older woman emerge from the crowd. It was Li Dao's wife, Mrs. Li. She pointed at the villagers, her voice dripping with reproach. I haven't been in this village long, but I have something to say. You are all far too disrespectful. The villagers asked her all at once, confused by her claim. How are we being disrespectful to the god? Mrs. Li thought to herself for a moment. She looked at them like ignorant peasants, but she knew she couldn't just stay silent. She grumbled that since the god had reappeared and helped so much, they owed him a temple. They should have sculpted a golden statue and offered him incense and proper quarters. When you pray to the heavens, all you do is kneel and beg for things, she snapped. She called them greedy for asking for favors without even performing a proper ceremony. The villagers stood there, completely stunned by her words. Mrs. Li realized these people truly hadn't seen the world and lectured them in a huff. She told them that even monks must bathe and change clothes before seeking a blessing. They ring bells and recite scriptures, and even then, Buddha might not listen. If you really want a favor from the gods, you need to at least ring a bell, burn incense, light a candle, and perform every single rite. The villagers suddenly had a realization. They hadn't been formal enough at all. They looked at the old woman and realized she was right. I heard all of this from outside the box and almost burst out laughing. Their little formalities didn't mean anything to me. But then, a light bulb went off in my head. Maybe these formalities actually made a lot of sense for right now. These little people are just so incredibly small. Their voices are tiny and faint to my ears. I often can't even hear what they're saying, even when they scream. If they just shout at the sky, their voices might get lost in the wind. Every time they want to ask for something, they need a signal. If they grab a massive bell and strike it hard, I'll hear it instantly. It turns out that ringing a bell actually has a practical use for me. I used to look down on these superstitious, old-world formalities. I never expected that I'd be the one finding them useful now. My modern, materialistic heart was starting to waver. The third lady kept lecturing the villagers with a torrent of words. Tomorrow morning, everyone will wash up and change their clothes, she ordered. Make sure you look presentable for the god. Especially you, young Gaoyu. You are the divine messenger chosen by the great sky god. Come to my house right now. I'll pick out some beautiful clothes for you to wear. You will lead the prayer to the god to bring us that blacksmith. And you, Lionin, don't you dare sleep tonight. Forge a massive bell by tomorrow morning. The villagers didn't dare object to the third lady's commands. I watched from above as the little people discussed their grand plans. It was so amusing that I decided to hold off on giving them the oil for now. I'll just wait and see what happens tomorrow morning. My gaze shifted to the villagers as the third lady kept plotting. These people. I realized these villagers could actually be quite useful to me. It reminded me of the cat I keep back at my house. The one from my profile picture that I've had for years. I adore that cat, so I bought him a nice house and plenty of toys. I love watching him jump around and play. When he wants something, he knows exactly how to ask for it. If he wants to eat, I buy him the best treats, cans, and cat lollipops. I even started growing fresh catnip just for him. I've spent tens of thousands of yuan on his vet bills, but that's just life. I spoil him because he behaves himself. But if he ever acts up, he gets a stern smack to learn his lesson. That's the mindset of a pet owner. And honestly, that was exactly how I was starting to view these little people. I'd already spotted the fatal flaw in Gaoyang Village. It looked like a structured group on the surface. But in reality, Gaoyang Village wasn't a real organization at all. It was nothing more than a loose pile of sand, ready to scatter. The village chief only has a voice because of his prestige, while the others have no say at all. There's no real hierarchy or chain of command among them. They're just a bunch of independent individuals. Every time I give them food, they just divide it up randomly and scurry back to their own homes. Nobody manages the resources, and there's a total lack of coordination for the village supplies. When the newcomers arrived, nobody even bothered to greet them until I stepped in myself. Just a moment ago, my followers suggested we hold off on taking action. But now, the third lady solved the summoning issue on her own, handling two of my problems at once. I thought back to that discussion I saw on the online forum. The guy in the fourth comment actually made a very good point. Over the next few days, my main goal should be finding more useful people to run things. That's the general direction I need to take. After the third lady finished scolding the villagers, they all scattered back to their beds. Meanwhile, those two blacksmiths gathered at the forge and got straight to work. They started studying how to forge a proper signal bell. Throughout the rest of the night. Of course, you can't just whip up a masterpiece in a single evening. I can't expect them to forge a legendary bell overnight. For now, something simple and functional will have to do. They decided on a simple design, like a large iron cylinder. The two of them fired up the furnace and got to work, with Little teaching Gao his techniques as they went. He wasn't worried about his apprentice surpassing him or stealing his livelihood. Little had already decided that once he regained his status as a commoner, he was done with the hammer. He wouldn't touch a piece of iron for the rest of his life. Even if he were starving, he'd rather jump off a cliff than be a blacksmith again. Early the next morning, well before the sun began to rise, the third lady forced Gao to get up and go wash himself. There's only one large pond in the village where anyone can bathe. It's crowded during the day, so he didn't dare wash there while the villagers were awake. He used the cover of darkness to bathe quickly, thinking no one could see him. Of course, they have no idea I have a night vision camera mounted outside the box. I'm recording everything happening inside this box 24 hours a day. If the guys on the forum knew I had this kind of view, they'd probably lose their minds with envy. I can only imagine their reaction. After he finished washing, the third lady pulled out a snow-white dress made of thick, high-quality fabric. The clothes were a bit too big for Gao's frame. They looked far too loose on him, but it didn't really matter. It's not like he needs to go out and work in the fields anyway. If the clothes don't fit perfectly, he just needs to move slowly and carefully. It's July, the start of the week, and the heat is already stifling. We're in the middle of a heat wave, and the residual temperature is unbearable. The thicker the fabric of those clothes, the more miserable he's going to be. But he has no choice but to endure it. The third lady helped him straighten his sleeves and smooth out the wrinkles while she whispered to him. She told him he must show absolute respect to the sky god. She insisted that when he invites the god out today, he must ask for his honorable name. We can't just keep calling him by any random title anymore. Once his true name is clear, we can finally build him a proper temple and form a guard for him. We could even sculpt a golden statue in his likeness, and Gao nodded in agreement. I understand, he said softly, as the third lady pulled out her makeup box. She began applying it to his face personally, stroke by stroke, carefully painting Gao's features. Back in my world, I was jolted awake by the sound of a bell. I had spent the entire night on the military history forum, digging through historical documents from the late Ming dynasty. I was looking for any advantage I could give them. Without realizing it, I hadn't crawled into bed until 2 or 3 in the morning. Thanks. Of course, I couldn't get up in the morning and ended up falling back asleep. Then, I heard the sound of a bell. I shook my head and forced myself to get out of bed. The landscape box was right there. It was sitting right next to my bed. I had placed it right beside my computer desk, and that ringing sound was coming from inside of it. The noise echoed across the floor. My brain slowly woke up as I remembered what happened last night. That sharp, ringing sound of the bells. It had to be the villagers summoning the sky god again. I rolled over to the edge of the bed and leaned my head over the side. I peered into the landscape box and thought, wow, these little guys really went all out today. They looked ready for a ceremony. All 42 villagers from the town of Badajoz were gathered there. Every single person from the village was present. The 32 families, the servants, and even the new blacksmith, Aguirre. A total of 48 people are now officially aligned with the Republic's government. They stood in a massive formation, looking like students in a high school parade. There was more. Lucia was so dressed up that she was almost unrecognizable. She was already young and beautiful to begin with. After putting on her makeup, Lucia headed over to her father's house. She possessed a dazzling beauty, a truly delicious splendor. If she lived in modern times, she'd be worshipped as a literal goddess. The army of simps around her would be large enough to form a cavalry squad. Even the wealthiest heirs would be lining up just to leave her a message. I watched her and thought, not bad. This girl is getting more interesting by the day. She was getting prettier, and honestly, it made me want to tease her even more. I shook the thought away and focused. Damn, that's terrible of me. I must be spending too much time reading those idiots on the internet forums. Down in the box, I saw Gao Weiwei raising a cup with both hands. He made a gesturing toast toward the sky, though his form was pretty sloppy. He clearly learned this at the last minute, honoring the heavens before pouring the liquid out. It was actually just water inside, which he spilled on the ground before kneeling. Behind him, the other 46 people all dropped to their knees in unison. Gao Weiwei began to recite a prayer that sounded like it was written in a massive hurry. He was stuttering through every sentence, but I wasn't really interested in his boring speech anyway. After a while, he finally finished reciting and shouted at the top of his lungs, "May we dare ask for your divine heavenly lordship's title, so that we may build a temple and carve a statue in your honor?" I decided to play along and answered him, "Li Daoxian." Gao Weiwei heard my voice and was instantly overcome with joy. He turned around and called out to the third lady. "The great sky god has answered. His name is Li Daoxian." The third lady heard those words and her face lit up with excitement. To her, that name sounded like a clear sign of a Taoist deity. She was a Taoist believer herself, but she'd been secretly worried about this religion business. She was terrified that the great sky god might turn out to be a Buddhist bodhisattva. If that happened, she'd be so embarrassed she might burn incense until she died of shame. But now, it was practically confirmed to be Taoism. Without a word, she dropped to her knees with a heavy thud. "Greetings to the venerable heavenly deity, Li Daoxian." Gao Weiwei followed her lead and hit the ground with another loud thud. The other 46 people immediately followed suit, shouting in perfect unison, "Greetings to the great Daoxian." I watched them from above, feeling pretty damn pleased with myself. Suddenly, I wasn't just some unknown god, I was the venerable Daoxian. Sanzer must have taught him those words, preparing speeches for both Taoism and Buddhism. He was reciting the Taoist version, first thanking me for my divine protection. He thanked me for letting the villagers move within the city walls, but then he made a request. He said they needed someone to stand guard at night and light lanterns along the walls. Those lanterns need a lot of oil, so he was begging his divine lord to grant them a supply. I have to admit, playing house with these little people is getting pretty fun. I decided to answer his prayer right then and there. While his raspy voice was still echoing, I reached for a jug of cooking oil. I carefully poured a small amount of the golden liquid. I filled the tiny plastic cap of a water bottle to the brim. Then, I reached down and placed the cap onto the ground. I set it down slowly right in front of Gao Weiwei. There you go. To me, a water bottle cap is nothing, barely worth a glance. It's only an inch wide and a fraction of an inch deep. But to these tiny beings, it looked like an immense, shimmering reservoir. To them, it was a massive structure that looked like it had stood for 1,000,000 years. The pond was filled to the edge with a mysterious, thick liquid. It was pure rapeseed oil, processed with the highest modern technology. The little people twitched their noses as the rich scent hit them. They could tell immediately it was rapeseed oil and of the highest quality. Good God, a reservoir of oil this massive? Most of them had never seen more than a tiny vial of oil in their entire lives. But this was a literal lake of it. Everything from the heavens is oversized to them. But these villagers were starving for fat. They hadn't tasted real rapeseed oil in years. 3 years ago, before the great drought hit, they actually had the chance to plant crops like rapeseed. They could press a little oil for the holidays, but after 3 years of scorched earth, not even the basic food crops could survive the heat. Who has the luxury of growing a cash crop like rapeseed in a wasteland, staring at a pond of oil deep enough to swim in? The villagers were absolutely losing their minds with joy. Gao Shugu was the first one to break the silence. Forget the lamps. I want to eat every drop of this. The village chief shut him down with a sharp glare. Did you already forget that massive rebel army passing to the south? They marched right past us last night, and all you can think about is your stomach? Our village is blessed by the heavens now. Gao Weiwei raised his voice. Under the great sky god's protection, we have food. Now we need security. The rest will be used for lanterns. Light a ring of fire along the city walls every night. Post sentries to patrol the perimeter at all hours. Never let your guard down. If you spot bandits approaching, the sentries will sound the alarm and everyone will join hands. You will take up arms to firmly defend the city gates. The village had to become a fortress. The villagers obeyed my orders immediately. As the great sky god, my word was law. I decided this rapeseed oil would be managed by Third Master. The rest of the villagers needed to focus on their own duties. The construction of the city walls had to continue. They couldn't stop building for a single second. The iron armor also needed to be forged as soon as possible. And Lita's new musket design required even more effort. There was still so much work to be done in this tiny world. The villagers heard that the distribution was over, and that the rapeseed oil was being entrusted entirely to Third Master. They were a bit surprised, thinking I would handle it like I usually do. Normally, I let everyone divide the resources amongst themselves. They didn't expect that this time, I'd put one man in charge of the whole supply. It was a strange move, but I knew exactly what I was doing. As curious as they were, no one dared to look me in the eye. No one dared to question me. They just dispersed quietly to handle their tasks. Third Master was secretly thrilled, thinking, the great sky god noticed my hard work. He felt like he had been given a divine promotion right then and there. It started here. First, I'd have him handle the small things. Then, the tasks would grow bigger and bigger. Eventually, he would become my true right-hand man in this world. That would be incredible, far better than being a mere clerk in a county office. I called out to him, and I continued speaking through the screen. Third Master immediately pressed his hands together in a respectful bow. He stood there, ready to listen to my every word. Great Sky God, he whispered. What are your orders? You should know why I entrusted the oil to you, shouldn't you? I understand, he replied. The villagers are like loose sand, scattered and disorganized. They only care about their own business, and they can't read or count. Organizing the oil for the lanterns every night is a massive job. If they manage it themselves, it'll be a disaster. There will be mistakes within days. Some might even steal oil from the lamps to use in their own homes. Humph, it's good that you understand, I said, my voice echoing from above. Now, stop trying to impress me with fancy idioms. Third Master scratched his head, looking a bit embarrassed by my bluntness. He loved adding a fancy idiom after every sentence. He wanted to show off his learning, but in front of the great sky god, it was useless. His erudition was like an ant trying to shake the sun and the moon. No matter how much he tried to brag, it was never enough. I didn't need endless explanations. I already knew the score. I let it slide with a smile and asked, what do you think this village lacks most? Third Master answered without hesitation, people. I reached out and placed a small hill of flower balls right in front of him. Use this flower to attract people, I commanded. Third Master was delighted and bowed deeply toward the empty air. Great Sky God, rest easy, he said. In this era, flour is more valuable than gold. With this, I can easily recruit as many people as we need. I watched him through the screen and said, tell me your specific plan first. He mentioned Wang Village, Shang Village, and Shun Village nearby. Most of the men from those three villages had joined Wang Hahai's rebel army, but there were always those who stayed behind, refusing to become bandits. Their lives were undoubtedly harder than ever before. I'll visit these villages with just one sack of flour, he boasted. I'm certain they will all surrender to us immediately. I smirked. His ideas aligned perfectly with my own. Having a man like this under my command definitely makes things easier. He's read countless historical documents that all share the same analysis. In any administration, the secretary is the pragmatist while the magistrate is the theorist. The magistrate handles the grand vision and the coordination. Once he ponders a decree, he hands it off to the secretary by his side. The secretary is the one responsible for the actual execution. Every concrete detail is supervised by him. The magistrate opens his mouth and the secretary breaks his back working. When it comes to practical skills, the secretary is actually superior. Of course, high-level political considerations are still Lyra Oxian's domain. I told him, very well, I'm leaving this in your hands. After saying those words, I went silent. I let my presence fade away from the screen. He watched my face slowly disappear among the clouds. To him, it looked like the great sky god was returning to the immortal realm. The moment I was gone, Lyra Oxian let out a thunderous laugh. He jumped a foot in the air, celebrating like it was a festival day. He had been dying to laugh out loud this whole time. But in front of the great sky god, he didn't dare be irreverent. He had to suppress his joy, but now he couldn't contain himself anymore. With his hands on his hips, he burst into laughter while Gao Weiwei let out a long sigh of relief. She finally relaxed her tense body, stretched her limbs, and turned to the third madam. Man, I've been standing here for a while now. Wearing this heavy outfit and keeping a solemn face is so exhausting. The The third madam looked at her with pure envy and said, "You have no idea how much jealous I am. And here you are complaining that the job is tiring?" Gao Weiwei quickly shook her head and said, "No, I'm not complaining. I'm just not used to it yet." The third madam's tone turned serious as she looked at the girl. "Young Weiwei, you are the saint of the great sky god, tasked with delivering his divine words. The more dignified you act, the more respect people will have for the great sky god. Never forget that," she warned, and Gao Weiwei immediately tried to fix her posture. "I understand," Gao Weiwei replied, as the third madam turned her attention toward Lyra Oxian. She looked at him like he was some kind of scoundrel and muttered about how the villagers understood nothing. It's been so long, and they still don't know how to properly serve the great sky god. They should use their savings to build him a temple and accumulate divine merit. Lyra Oxian didn't hesitate for a single second. "We will sell everything we own to build this temple," he declared without blinking. "But here in Gao Village, I have one major concern. I'm afraid we have the money, but we don't actually know how to spend it correctly." Even though I had hidden myself behind the clouds, I hadn't actually left. I was still watching. I was standing right over the landscape box. I had just closed the glass lid and was peering through the surface. After days of experimenting, I finally figured out how this world works. If I lift the lid to look inside, Gao Weiwei can see me appearing through the clouds. But if I watch them through the glass, even she can't sense my presence. Human nature is a strange thing. It's one thing to be watched openly, but another to be observed in secret. It was actually quite pleasant watching Gao Weiwei and the others now that the god had left. Seeing them reveal their true natures was far more interesting. Lyra Oxian thinks I need a temple to house my body, but I know it's unnecessary. Still, if these little people want to keep themselves busy, I'll let them. There's no need for me to intervene yet. Besides, there are only 40 people in this entire village. Whatever they want to build, they'll be limited by their lack of manpower, not money. I decided to stay back and see how they played this out. Gao Weiwei started by ordering the villagers to head outside. They brought out oil drums and purple oil bottles to gather the supplies. Everyone scrambled to fill their household containers with rapeseed oil. The young men of the village banded together to lift the heavy mineral water caps. They looked like a swarm of ants desperately hauling massive objects. They worked through the middle of the night in that miniature city. They hauled the remaining oil caps back to their small temporary homes. Next, they had to deal with the massive pile of flour. The flour Lyra Oxian had dropped into the box had clumped into giant balls. Lyra went to the village chief, Ankro, and she ordered Gao Weiwei and the other young men to get to work. They had to grind those flour boulders back into a fine powder, making it look like ordinary flour again. Gao Weiwei ground the flour while grumbling to Uncle Trey. "Why are we even doing this?" he muttered. "Having to crush these all over again is such a pain." Lyra flicked his forehead and said, "You don't understand anything. I'm going to use this flour to trade with outsiders and lure people to our village. Flour that looks like giant white spheres is far too strange to be seen. If government officials see something that bizarre, who knows what they'll do? We have to grind it down to keep everyone fooled." I watched from above, impressed by her caution.